Happy good morning. Happy art time for starting our presentation here. We're all ready to get started. A bit of weather and a bit of technology. Thank you all for being here. I think I know most people in the room, but I am Scott Scherer. I'm a professor of art history here at UTSA and also a director of the art gallery. And I'm very pleased you all were able to join us here on this very blustery day. And it's nice to be able to use the word blustery because it tends to just show up in kids' plays. I'm very pleased to be able to have the opportunity to organize a symposium with our panelists. We're going to have just a brief introduction to what we're doing today, and I want to say just a few words. I'll briefly introduce the panelists, and then we'll have two folks do short their presentation first, and then we'll have some snacks upstairs, and then two more presentations and a roundtable discussion. I think it's important that we don't assume and take for granted that we live in a world where diversity and difference is respected, valued, honored, nurtured, and cherished and loved. Often it seems in so many aspects of everyday life that we witness calm, peace, and joy, but quickly our energies and hopes can be dashed. Considering the social, cultural, economic, and political history of the U.S., from the origins of European ideas of the Americas, the colonial periods, and the birth of new nations, the horrors of slavery and violences that did not end with the Civil War, and the experiences we live with in the present, it's disheartening that thoughtful considerations and scholarly work, and then creative arts that are under the umbrella of critical race theory have prompted outrage and condemnation. How far away it seems that Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream that his 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This week, rulings have come down in trials regarding the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. And yesterday was the 10th anniversary of the death of Trayvon Martin. Last weekend, my kids, who are among just a handful of black kids in our subdivision, wanted to play in our community park. It's just about 5 blocks from our house. And they insisted that their bright orange Nerf guns be taken in the car. It took me a few minutes to realize that they weren't just being lazy, but they were thinking of safety. And I wonder if I've taught them well or not, and at what cost. But relative to that negativity, thank goodness for the arts, and for all of us that are here today. This symposium is something that I've been very much interested in doing for a long time, and I think it's very significant that we turn our attention to efforts to proceed with making our world a better place. I'm pleased that UTSA has been a support as a Hispanic-serving institution and one that supports the needs of many first-generation students. And I'm fortunate to have been able to host years of exhibitions that present the richness of critical and creative approaches in the arts. Today we are fortunate to be able to learn from the experience and words and wisdom of a group of accomplished individuals who have diverse practices as artists, curators, writers, and activists in the arts. We'll hear from Bonansinga from Cincinnati, Moody, Castro from Cruces, New Mexico, Benito, Huerta from Arlington, and Vicki, Meek, who lives in Dallas. And I'm very pleased that Aïssatou, Sidimé-Blanton, who's in the front row here, will be our moderator for our discussion. I'd like to thank the Texas Commission on the Arts for this support. Support from a Teaching and Learning Reimagined grant from the Office of Academic Innovation that I have with my colleague Moody. I'd like to thank Wesley Uchiyama-Penix in the Department of Music, who helped us organize materials here in the recital hall. And there's a fantastic crew in the art department, Dane Patterson, Martin Rodriguez, Victor Guerrero, Rocky Guerrero, Greg Elliott, who is very supportive, as blustery as he can be in a blustery day. And I also like to thank Sarah Lasley, who has helped mightily with the conceptual underpinnings of this symposium contributed so generously her expertise in setting up the technology for today. There's that. I'd like to introduce Kate, our first speaker. Kate is director of the School of Art, in the College of Design, Architecture, Art, and Planning at the University of Cincinnati. She's also a professor and teaches courses about curatorial practice. She's the founding director of the Stanley and Gerald Rubin Center for the Visual Arts at the University of Texas at El Paso. She has curated many, many exhibitions, both in standard art galleries and in non-gallery settings. Kate is also the author of Curating at the Edge, Artists Respond to the U.S.-Mexico Border from UT Press in 2014. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that kind introduction. Can you hear me? Okay. Is that better without my mask?
If you like, Mike, you just have to put the little switch on top. It is a switch on the top. You get that spot? It's a little right here.
Is that better? Oh, that's like So thank you again, Scott, for the kind invitation and for the kind introduction.
Just use Zoom and start it.
I believe Zoom is on.
Yes, it is.
We're still seeing waiting for the host to start the meeting.
Is it the different link than the one that was logged in on the account?
Is it a 2504 ID?
I just logged into the one that was on the account.
Let me
Sorry.
see.
I'm sorry.
It should be the same one, but I did this.
This is one who was trying to attend to business. Just like
That's insane.
That number.
What number do you have, Aïssatou?
use it in 2504.
We figured it out, yes. Thank you for catching that. Yeah.
Yes. Hide the participants. Share screen, PowerPoint. That, and now they are coming in. Excellent. Great. All right. Carry on.
Thank you for your patience. Okay.
I'm so sorry. It's a nitpicky thing, but isn't that too far off
that screen over there. Sorry. It'll bother me the whole time and I won't be able to listen, Kate. There you go. You're in.
Okay, good. So thank you again, Scott, for the introduction and for the kind invitation to be here. It's really nice to be in Texas. I've timed this for about a 20-minute presentation, and I've scripted it so that I don't forget to say anything, because I'm going to share with you a really complicated exhibition that I worked on for about 4 years. It took a long time to incubate and realize it. So I don't need to be overly formal or scripted, but I will be reading from a text because I don't want to forget any of the important points that I want to make to you today. So this is a story of an exhibition by Mexico City-based artist Tanya Candiani at the Contemporary Arts Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 2020. It addressed female labor, technology, and race through the lens of local history. I served as a guest curator of the exhibition and will share with you today its genesis, process, and results. The room is dark and cavernous, a spotlight on its center, where a circle of women stand 2 feet deep, facing inward. They are squealing ferociously, animal-like, as if they are desperate to protect something at the inner sanctum. This is one scene from 4 Industries, the 22-minute-long, 3-channel video installation that was the centerpiece of the exhibition, Sounding Labor Silent Bodies, which featured 6 new pieces by the artist, Tanya Candiani, along with historic ephemera. The women are volunteer members of Cincinnati, Ohio's Muse Choir, invited by Candiani to star in 4 Industries as both symbol of and challenge to mechanization. They replicated with their voices the sounds of the machines that dominated Cincinnati's late 19th century industrial production: slaughterhouses, woodworking, printmaking, and metalsmithing. Candiani visited Cincinnati in 2017 and became interested in the city's history of innovative manufacturing, which connects to her ongoing investigation of how technology displaces human labor and mechanization supplants handwork. This understanding is particularly prescient during a time when our dependence on technology is more profound than ever before and determines if and how we connect to one another. But before we delve into the story of this exhibition and its making and how complex it was, I want to give you a bit of background on the artist. Candiani began exhibiting her artwork in the early 2000s in Tijuana, Mexico, where she resided at the time, with a body of artwork titled Fat, larger than life-size soft sculptures of nude female figures that brought attention to mass media's encouragement of thinness. Fat connected to Candiani's interest in unreasonable expectations of women to look and be a certain way. This would eventually develop into artwork such as 4 Industries about the under-recognized role of women's labor, both inside and outside of the home, and in women's quiet insistence on improving the status quo. Fat is the work that I saw when I visited the artist in Tijuana on a quest to commission artists to create artwork about the US-Mexico border. I was at the time director of art galleries at the University of Texas at El Paso. The opportunity to bring Candiani to El Paso finally came 9 years later in 2009. By that time, the artist was moving towards the role of mentor and director rather than maker for some of her artworks, a shift that permitted increase in scale and impact. In Battleground, for instance, which she produced for her exhibition in El Paso, she guided student artists in the transformation of kitchen tools to be both weapons and body armor. They then performed in both El Paso and Juarez, on either side of the US-Mexico border, standing silently wearing these sculptures, prepared to deflect the day-to-day uncertainty embedded in this territory associated with immigration and illegal drug trafficking. In Battleground, Candiani moved from representing the human form as a method of challenging social norms, as she had in Fat, to staging actual human bodies as a method of expression and resistance. Her skills in directing other artists in performative actions is evident here and had matured by the time she directed 4 Industries. During the 6 years after Battleground, Candiani catapulted in recognition, and by 2015, she represented the country of Mexico in the Venice Biennale. By that time, I had relocated to Cincinnati to teach and administer at University of Cincinnati. I was enthused by Candiani's recent recognition and invited her to be visiting artist at the University of Cincinnati in 2017. During that 3-day visit, she became so interested in our city that she engaged in archival and boots-on-the-ground research about its history for the following 3 years. What she developed for Cincinnati during that time continued her trajectory of working with large groups of participants under unusual conditions. For example, for Sirens, she had filmed a choir on the pier of Naui Port in Gdansk, Poland. It was dark and cold. Ankle-deep snow was on the ground. The choir called the ships back to shore, their collective voice like a foghorn. This sound action manifested Candiani's interest in using a choral group to interpret, replicate, or deconstruct sounds that were not typical of human speech, just as 4 Industries would. Another example is Pulse, which was carried out in 12 underground stations of the Mexico City subway. In a 1-day performance, 195 women, which is the same number of subway stops there are in Mexico City, each dressed in a loose and identical huipil, a pre-colonial coverall, also carried and beat a drum, shaped like a teponatzil, a pre-Hispanic instrument that was shaped like a vulva and used only by men. As men beat the drum, they believed that all feminine power transferred to them. For Pulse, the performers dyed their hands with cochineal, a red pigment consisting of the dry, pulverized bodies of insects that lived on cacti in Mexico and other warm regions. The Aztecs used cochineal dye to make themselves appear fearsome and to intimidate their enemies in battle. Here, female bodies claimed public space, as well as instruments that were once forbidden to them. They were painting a color associated with masculinity. Women took control. During Candiani's 3-day visit in 2017 as the university's artist in residence, she and I pitched the idea of a solo exhibition by her, guest curated by me, to Stephen Matisio, who was curator at the Contemporary Art Center at the time. And here you see an image of the building that houses the Contemporary Art Center in downtown Cincinnati. We shook hands in agreement, and Candiani hit the ground running. The exhibition ultimately consisted of 2 drawings, 2 video works, and 2 sculptures by Candiani, all created specifically for the exhibition, plus a historical book and 5 historical lithographs. The gallery at the Contemporary Art Center where Candiani's work was exhibited has 2 distinct areas. The front has 24-foot-high ceilings. In the back, they are 11. The front gallery was primarily occupied by 4 Industries, which nearly surrounded its audience. Also in the front gallery, but requiring much less visual and actual space, were the framed and altered score for 4 Industries, which you see here on the back wall, the historical accordion book, and Procession, which was a book of drawings by Candiani that responded to the historical one, which you see here on your right. It's a display of the historical book it's kind of difficult to see in that slide, but its exhibit is horizontally, and then her response was at an angle above it. Here is one page of the score for metalworking after Candiani had overlaid it with her marks. This is one of the 2 drawings in the exhibition. Procession, which I'll describe momentarily, is the other. So in fall 2017, directly following her August visit to Cincinnati, the artist lived in Washington, D.C. for 2 months and conducted archival research during a Smithsonian Artist and Research Fellowship. The Dibner Library of the History of Science and Technology at the National Museum of American History, which is a Smithsonian institution, houses several volumes, each titled Report of the Board of Commissioners, Cincinnati's Industrial Exposition. Candiani read these reports and was struck by the patriarchal language and colonial-era character of the messages in them, and this guided her decision that the exhibition would react to the late 19th century age of industry and self-congratulatory empire building. She planned to create an artwork in which the human voice would invoke mechanized sound. Her experience working with large groups gave us the confidence to invite Cincinnati's Muse Choir, which is an audition volunteer choir that self-identifies as inclusive and as an inclusive and feminist choral community advocating for social justice. One focus of the exhibition would be women's labor. Cincinnati was known for pork packing, woodworking, industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, textiles, metalwork, soap, candles, whiskey, beer, books, and printing. And all of these industries were highlighted at the Cincinnati Grand Industrial Expos. 14 of them took place between 1870 and 1888, and each had a grand parade to celebrate its opening. Cincinnati was chartered as a town in 1809 and named after Cincinnatus, a Roman farmer who was recruited to be a military leader and who embodied selflessness and civic virtue. By 1860, Cincinnati was the leading industrial center in the Midwest and the third largest manufacturing center in the United States. Intrigued to build upon her discoveries at the Smithsonian, Candiani returned to Cincinnati in 2018 to visit the archive of the Cincinnati Art Museum Library and the University of Cincinnati's Archives and Rare Books Library. Roma, Panorama of the Procession of the Order of Cincinnatus from 1883, is an accordion book illustrating the floats for the opening day procession of the 1883 Industrial Exposition, where Greek myths and Roman victories played out on each of those floats. And here you see Roma as it was displayed in the exhibition, juxtaposed with Candiani's interpretation of it. Here you can see a detail of one of Candiani's silhouettes, with commentary that ties Roman military battle played out on the expo float to those of Don Juan Oñate, the infamous Spanish conquistador. Thus, she created connections between the unhappy results of injustice and imperial actions from multiple periods and places, reminding us that history repeats itself. At the University of Cincinnati Library, Candiani viewed the lithographs that advertised the expositions. They were products of one of Cincinnati's manufacturing strengths, which was printmaking, and also an advertising strategy. In them, city, state, and the arts were personified as women, and the building where the expositions took place was nearly always represented and sometimes objectified. During 2018 and 2019, Candiani and Jillian Harrison-Jones, the director of Muse, had a few conversations, and by mid-spring of 2019, Harrison-Jones committed to Muse's participation in the exhibition. During the months that Candiani was researching and conceptualizing the show, I toured multiple sites as potential stages for the filming of 4 industries. I recommended that the Contemporary Arts Center rent Felsen House, a former brewery turned event space. By then, Candiani had decided to focus on metalworking, printmaking, woodworking, and pork packing in 4 industries. She located sound archives of historical machines and coupled them with sounds of contemporary machinery and factories. Printmaking and pork packing were decidedly important to Cincinnati's history, and wood and metal less so, but the sounds of these factories compelled the artists. She collaborated with composer Rogelio Sosa, here on the far right. You can see his photograph in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. He's on the far right. And Rogelio, with Candiani, created the score. Olene Miranda, who is second from the right in the photograph, who's been collaborating with Candiani since 2012, assisted her in the filming, and both of them traveled to Cincinnati to be there with her while it was filmed. Candiani is in the hat, the third from the right, and Amara Antilla, who became senior curator at the Contemporary Arts Center after Stephen Maticio's departure, is on the far left. And as a side, Stephen is now here in Texas. He's the director of the Blaffer Art Museum at the University of Houston. I invited him to come today, but he was unable to be here. But he's a great talent, and you are lucky to have him here in your community. Lightborn Communications, a Cincinnati-based film and animation company under Candiani's direction, filmed both For Industries and Speech for an Empty Theater, which I will describe later. And here you see some shots of For Industries being filmed at Felsen House. The filming of For Industries took place in December of 2019 for 2 days at 12 hours each day. Between the crew and the choir, there were a total of about 85 people present for those long periods of intensive work. Simultaneously energized and exhausted, Candiani returned to Mexico City to begin work with Miranda and a 3-person post-production team on the editing of the footage for For Industries. Here's For Industries being filmed. Here's a score of metalworking before Candiani altered it to create it to be a drawing in the exhibition. And here's a storyboard for printmaking above the resulting film. This is woodworking. So 2 months prior to the filming of For Industries, in October of 2019, we rented Springer Auditorium, Music Hall's central and main concert hall, the main hall of the building where the industrial expositions took place in the 19th century. So it's a still extant building. Cincinnati Symphony performs there. Sometimes the ballet performs there. When it was actually built in the late 19th century to be a site for the expositions. So here we filmed Speech for an Empty Theater, a single channel video. Harrison Jones, who's African American, would recite a composite of messages that Candiani had collaged from the opening addresses published in Report of the Board of Commissioners, Cincinnati's Industrial Exposition. At the time that the words were written, an African American female would not have been afforded the opportunity to recite them before an audience. Ms. Harrison Jones's race and gender would point out the irony that the industrial expositions claimed to champion progress from the perspective of technology, but were products of their time from the perspective of social mobility. She would also create a clear link between Speech for an Empty Theater and For Industries. Candiani referred Lightborn to Shirin Nishat's Turbulent as a predecessor of a film and a predecessor and an example of a film that provides a perspective from the stage looking out at empty seats where the audience should be. For Speech for an Empty Theater, the camera would be repositioned only one time. The first position would be on a circular track on the stage, the camera circling around its subject and only a few feet from her. The second position would be in the gallery seats for a wide and distant perspective. Here is a still from the video with a close-up of Harrison Jones that was captured on the circular track. And here is the piece as it was installed in the exhibition. Working Women is one of the 2 sculptures in the exhibition, which you see here on the right, comprised of 16 ceramic tiles. The inspiration for Candiani's Working Women are 2 photographs attributed to the artist Wynald Rice. Again, it might be difficult to see on the screen, but one photograph, which you see here in the upper left corner, features a female and male worker attending to an offset press on the factory floor of the U.S. Playing Card Company, which was and is based in the Cincinnati area. The other photo, which you see in the top row center, is of an offset press at Champion Paper Company, also Cincinnati-based company. Reese conflated these 2 scenes for one of the 16 mosaic murals celebrating Cincinnati's industries that he produced for the city's Union Terminal, which was completed in 1933. You see an image of that mosaic in the bottom right, center. Whereas Reese chose to remove the female figure in his mosaic, Candiani honors her, correcting Reese's erasure. She stands at the machine, engrossed in her work. Working Women was fabricated in Cincinnati at Rookwood Pottery, which was a company founded in 1880 by a woman and recognized internationally as the preeminent art pottery producer in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Rendered in flat geometric sections of colorfully glazed ceramic tile, Working Women encapsulates this exhibition's focus on historic manufacturing and under-recognized women laborers everywhere, historically and today. When we opened the exhibition in July of 2020, the piece was not yet complete. Rookwood had closed during spring 2020 due to COVID-19. We displayed the vector drawing used by the fabricator for the first few weeks of the exhibition. This shows how it was displayed in relationship to speech to an empty theater. CAC staff actually framed the piece. And the second sculpture in the exhibition, and the final piece that I will share with you today, is Divided We Fall, which was created in collaboration with artist and sculptor Tyler Hamilton. Hamilton created a mold of an architectural detail on an interior wall of Cincinnati's Music Hall that depicts a spread-winged eagle, characteristic of the building's renowned 19th century revivalist Gothic architecture. The eagle is framed by a swirling vine pattern reminiscent of a coat of arms. The eagle was appropriated as a seal of the United States, an emblem of European nobility that can be traced back to ancient Rome and is a symbol of national freedom. Rendered in raw fiberglass and displayed here with this rubber shell, the motif appears devoid of its prior grandeur and is exposed as a fabricated duplicate, alluding to the hollow rhetoric of nation building of America's industrial period. So I want to conclude with just a few more installation shots of images of 4 industries, so you can get a sense of the magnificence of the piece. Thank you so much for listening and for your time. Oh yeah, absolutely. If now's the time to answer a question, I'm happy to take them.
Comments or questions?
Any questions?
China?
I can't see, so I can't see the lights. Oh, there you go. Yeah, please.
Was this the end of the exhibition, or does it end at 2?
No.
I didn't understand what you said.
So, the symposium is continuing to the afternoon. This is just the
Oh,
first thing.
Thank you.
China?
What was the hard, during the exhibition, what was the hardest part you found when installing the exhibition site, if you don't mind sharing?
Installing it?
Yeah, when you were installing it.
I think that there weren't that many. Well, I will say that the 3-channel video installation had a lot of sort of requirements as far as type of projector and type of. It was really the projectors that were the issue. They weren't 4K compatible, and she had filmed in 4K, which was the latest technology. So there was a lot of sort of tension and distress around that the resolution wasn't high enough quality, didn't really meet the artist's expectations. And we were in a position where we couldn't afford to buy the projectors that would have best suited the piece. So of all the pieces in the exhibition, most of which are pretty Cincinnati specific, that is the one that I think has more sort of universal appeal. And I think that the artist will find additional exhibition venues to show it in the future. And hopefully those venues will have the capability of securing 4K compatible projectors so she can really realize that sort of heightened detail that she was trying to accomplish. That was one of the biggest installation challenges, I would say.
Can I follow up on this?
Yeah.
Just to ask on that too, like the choice to make all the projections kind of full size, was that like, I'm just thinking about like embodiment for the viewer?
Yeah.
And presence? Like,
Yeah.
is that kind of?
I mean, that was definitely, conceptually, it upheld the idea that they were larger than life. You felt completely, in my experience, I felt completely enfolded by, and the sound, I regret not, I've got actually a recording of the sound that you can access on Vimeo, which I thought about including, but it would have taken me over my time limit. But you were just completely surrounded by these eerie human voices doing things that they typically don't do. And also just the scale was larger than you were. And so it did convey the power, sort of feminine, female assertion and power in a really, a way, as you said, it was embodied through feeling as well as intellect.
And intimacy in those close-ups too.
That's right, yeah. Yeah,
Since you mentioned the idea of having an artist envision something that you couldn't necessarily, fulfill,
yeah,
can you talk a little bit about the way a curator navigates that
yeah,
challenge? When
yeah.
you want to honor the artist and
Yeah.
everything they say, but maybe financially it's impossible.
Yeah, there's a lot of diplomacy involved, I think, especially as a guest curator, because I didn't have access to the institutional sort of resources that I might have had were I a staff curator. And that was kind of a dance that I danced for the whole 3 years that the project was in process. And when I said it was a handshake between the TCO and us, that was literally all we had. We didn't have a contract, which I highly encourage, that if you engage in a project, you try to get something down on writing so you know what can be spent and by whom and when. And so every step of the project way, and she is very ambitious, has an incredibly vast and deep vision, had so many ideas of what we could do with the exhibition. It was always like sort of trying to bring Tanya down to reality, what was possible at this place, financially and physically, and then expressing her passion and capability to the museum too. So that was my role, really, is to sort of champion the artist to the museum and vice versa. And I did a lot of scrambling, we would kind of fundraise along the way, because we had I introduced her to several patrons in Cincinnati, and one of the greatest things I'm proudest of is that 2 of the pieces were actually purchased. The accordion book, Procession, was purchased by the Cincinnati Art Museum. It's now in their collection, which is fantastic. And then Working Women was purchased by a private collector in Cincinnati who has a collection that focuses on feminist artwork, so it's a perfect fit. So they both, the collector contributed quite a bit to help the museum realize the exhibition, and then a couple of other private patrons also. And that kind of came, well, we want to do this other piece. We're ready to, not only do we want to do a 3-channel video installation, but we want to do this piece of Brooklyn pottery. They donated all of their labor in kind, all of the materials, all of the glaze. Lightborn Industries donated the majority of their laborers to film. So all of these Cincinnati-based companies that were involved in the production of the new work were in-kind contributors. So all of that took persuasion. And I think because the show was focused on Cincinnati, that was a real advantage to earning support, local support. And we just focus on the fact that this is a globally known artist that's taken interest in our local history. But yeah, I think that's one of the, as a curator, that's like 70% of what you do, is you communicate between parties so that you can help artists understand where the institution is coming from and vice versa, and audiences too.
How was the artwork received by the Cincinnati citizens?
Actually, very well. We had a few really great reviews and a lot of positive audience feedback. I will say it was up from July of 2020 until January of 2021. So because of the pandemic, there were windows where the museum was more open and people were more willing to go out. But then there were times when I think the museum attendance wasn't quite as robust as usual because of the pandemic. But it was well received, critically acclaimed too. And the Muse Choir was really excited. They all came out for it and went multiple times to see it. So that was another way of audience building, because we had so many partners
in the exhibition, they would all bring their constituents, and that expanded our audience. Yeah.
A follow-up question, so how did you, what advice would you have for promotion? Like, how were you promoting, if you wanted to promote the exhibit, how were you doing that to make sure as many people got out as possible?
I mean, I think social media is the best method at this point. As far as reach and cost, it's the best way to go. And word of mouth.
Kate, I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you experience the audience understanding of what the thoughts are relative to 19th century history and the present. What are your thoughts about how that kind of people thinking about Cincinnati outside of the present, because our blinders are usually now?
Yeah, and Cincinnati's golden age was, in the United States, many cities I think were experiencing that sort of renaissance in the 1880s, 90s, and 1900. That 20-year period was very a fertile time, I think, in many cities in the U.S. I think that how to make history relevant, that's always, the challenge of the historian, I think. But to think about what we tried to do was to say, look, that we were a very technologically advanced city at that time. There's no reason why we can't be that again. And sort of increase the level of ambition and pride in the place where we live and what it's capable of. So that was really one of the goals of the show from my perspective, is to remind people of the glory we once had and why not, there's no reason why we can't have it again. And I think that's true of many regional cities in the United States. Like, we can assert our importance. I don't know if that answers your question, but that was
a little bit more. I'm kind of curious though, do you think people are recognizing that we kind of live really relative to that past, or does it seem like really divorced from like the early 20th century to now? Just like a gap.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think there's a connection that people are thinking about?
No, I don't think there's a connection people are thinking about really. Between the industrial age and the technological age, which is what we're currently experiencing, I think in general people aren't making that connection about how both periods are a time of great change and great technological progress.
Great exploitation.
Yeah, that's right. Did y'all hear that? And great exploitation, especially financially, which might mean, a bigger and bigger rift between the classes, two social classes.
I did wonder, like, people see this exhibit, they recognize that the women weren't, like, the underrepresented nature, of their labor, and they see that as that time, and I wondered if there was a little bit of a introspection about it currently still happening, like.
I think there was more of a connection to that than to the technological part, yes. That though there's been great progress in women's sort of social standing, there's still inequity. And we shouldn't stop fighting for equity. Yeah.
So I grew up in Ohio. I remember reading one of the big things about the education and focusing on industry and how it was developed and whatnot. How did this exhibit interact with the local maybe high schools or middle schools and kind of talking about that? What was the dialogue there?
Well, we did a lot of educational programming, created educational materials, all of which you can find on the Contemporary Arts Center website. If you go there, you can have access to all of those didactic materials that we created. And I know that there were many schools that visited the exhibition, but to be honest, I don't have specifics on the response of those students. And I think that's one place where the arts could really do better, is tracking audience engagement and response. We're really good at launching really cool projects, but the longitudinal data of the impact they make is not as mature in our field. And I think there's a lot of room for people to do that, and I would encourage people who are students of fine arts and arts history to think about how they could become more involved in that, assessing the impact. Yeah.
I guess that's kind of what my question was. Like, did you have any pushback from the community about being critical of the community's past?
No. Not that I'm aware of. People might have been whispering it under their, but there was nothing publicly said, and nothing said to me personally. I mean, I think that, yeah, no, we can't really deny our history. I mean, people try to deny history, but.
Well, this is why I'm asking.
Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Our next speaker is Leslie Moody Castro. She's an independent curator and writer. She works a lot with, in collaboration with artists. She's produced and collaborated on projects in Mexico and in the US. And she has lots of critical writing that's very much about the ideas of place. She is committed to working with these ideas of exchange and dialogue, and she's the co-founder of Unlisted Projects, which is an artist residency program in Austin. She has been a curator and artistic director of the 6th edition of the Texas Biennial, and she's been a curator resident in Galveston. She's currently the inaugural curatorial fellow at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces. Leslie.
Sarah, tell me if the mic is too much. I'll leave it on for now.
Sounds okay. Do you guys prefer mic?
Yes. Yeah, we're okay with mic? Okay. It's just a little intimidating. It's all right. I'm going to talk specifically about a project that I worked on in Amarillo, Texas. This project was actually the sort of result of my time doing a road trip for the Texas Biennial in 2017, which was the first time I traveled to Amarillo. And from that project in 2017, I became very good friends with an artist on the ground, an artist and educator in Amarillo named John Rivette, who would then invite me back to Amarillo at least once a year to work with his students at West Texas A&M University. From one of my trips back to Amarillo, and I don't think that the slides are actually going, let's see. From one of my trips in Amarillo, he introduced me to Alex Gregory, who was a curator at the Amarillo Museum of Art, where the Amarillo Museum of Art had a biennial that they produced, and I think that it had been in its 9th edition when they invited me. And so it was something that they'd done every 2 years that in the past had been more related to like theme, or sorry, like medium more than anything. So the one that I had visited when I saw was like architecture, then one after that was about watercolor. And so this was the first time that they were really interested in doing a biennial that was actually based on social justice in any way. And I actually have these slides set to kind of scroll through. They're not in any particular order, but it looks like they're not scrolling through, so I just get it started.
They should be scrolling, but if you're not, could you hit that key? Otherwise, I'll have to do some technology that I'm not sure why it's not working.
Okay, cool. So these are just basically install shots of the entire exhibition that I'm just going to kind of talk over as they're sort of going through. So this was the first, like I mentioned, this is the first time that the museum had even sort of approached the idea of doing a socially justice-based biennial or exhibition for that matter. And considering the fact that this is in the Panhandle, for the institution to take something on like this was kind of a really big step for them. And it was something that I didn't realize at the time, and until almost like up to the beginning, or sorry, the opening of the show, that there were a lot of nerves and a lot of sort of nervousness around the opening of this project. To produce, this was probably one of the easier shows I've ever done, so it's great that you're asking me to talk on this, Scott. Since the institution had so much of a history of producing this, they already had the infrastructure around it, essentially. And so all I really had to do was choose the artist and the work. In the end, I decided on, we had I want to say close to 200 submissions for this show. And we invited 46 artists to participate. This biennial is called the AMOA 600 because artists within the radius of 600 miles of Amarillo can apply. We decided during the application process, while the call was open, that we wanted to extend that, and we didn't really put parameters on what that extension was, and so I just told people to apply and see how it kind of all fit together. So what was really great about that was we were able to bring in artists that were actually working on the Texas-Mexico border, and we had some really young artists from Brownsville apply, some from Matamoros. I had an artist who is originally from Victoria, Texas, but now lives in Puerto Rico, for example, who was part of the exhibition as well. And so we had this reach that was really unexpected. And so I put all of this work together, just to kind of try to, as you do when you're doing open calls, sort of it's kind of like a puzzle piece it all together in what it would look like in this space. And the show became so big that they decided that this biennial really needed the time and the focus so that it took over the entire museum, which is a 3-level museum, and that had never happened before. Usually the biennial show is only on the first 2 floors. That said, this was also the first year that the artists received an honorarium for their work and for participating in the show. That was a really big step for this institution. That had never happened before, but I really fought for it because in a white-led institution, you cannot have work by people of color for free. Not to mention the fact that they had to ship their own work there, and so it didn't make any sense to pay to participate in this show without receiving an honorarium of some sort. So we were able to put an application fee in place to pay artists for their participation, which was great. So at least they were able to kind of break even with this show, if not actually earn some money from it. So we had artists from all over the state of Texas. We had some artists from Oklahoma. We had artists from all over the Panhandle. We had artists whose work was also sort of interactive. So this is a piece that talks on climate change and is called Glacier, and it's basically records that are screen printed, and you are able to take them away. And so the install for the show was so easy because the curator just knew his space so well that I was able to just kind of show up. And the work was already installed. We made a few adjustments. It was like smooth sailing until the day before the opening, when I was told that the community members and a lot of the supporters of the Amarillo Museum of Art were so nervous and in so much protest of this project, they weren't going to show up. The institution also kind of stopped doing a lot of their social media that they would have done, so that it wasn't getting the sort of buzz that it needed to get. So there was this tension that was happening in the community of this institution that we were sort of hitting against in a lot of ways. So I decided that this needed to be diffused, of course, and I took to social media and started doing a lot of posts, both in Facebook and Instagram, to really sort of build the hype of the show and to really talk about the artists that were in it and the process as well. And then I also realized that one of the things that needed to happen to sort of diffuse this was that we just needed to we just needed a moment in the opening of the show to just kind of bring that tension down. There happened to be an artist from San Antonio, David Alcantar, who was invited to participate in the show, who basically dresses up as Superman and carries a flag that says vote and goes on these long runs in neighborhoods where he's invited to perform this piece. So the day of the opening, I actually decided to go on a run with him. And so we would show up at the opening. We would be there for 10 minutes. He would run around the space, And then he and I would sort of take off together outside and just go running in the neighborhood. And then come back, run through the space again, and then take off and then go running through the neighborhood. And so it was just like this action that sort of, this is the performance piece. It was this action that sort of like brought down the tension of the space, because everyone was kind of like, oh, where is David now? And where is Leslie now? And what's happening? And why is Superman music would come on in the background? And so that was the reaction, exactly. And so it was kind of this moment to really sort of just diffuse a lot of things. And then I had to give a talk at the opening, which we all know is no fun. And so in the talk, you know, I was like in my sweats and in my running gear and this like ridiculous neon sweater and like a gold or silver hat or something, and just talked about how the role of the institution and the step that they had taken in producing this exhibition in a white-led institution, in an area where there is historical discrimination, how this was an incredible step just to begin a process, a conversation of talking about things like this. This is the security guard there who said that it was one of the first exhibitions that he actually felt that he was represented in the show, which was a huge step. And this is one of the artists who decided to perform in the moment. I had no idea he was going to do that. He showed up with a US flag wrapped around him, and it was tied to a kettlebell at the bottom. Yeah, so the exhibition actually ended up becoming, while it was easier in process to produce, it actually ended up becoming something that was really important for the area and for the institution itself. And then the subject of getting artists paid was something that came up constantly, because it was something that was just a no-brainer for me, but within the institution it actually caused a major stir, which was another thing that I didn't know about until much later. The institution really fought back on it. The curator very much supported me, and so I didn't even realize that there was a sort of institutional sort of infighting happening about this idea of paying people, which is something that, again, for the museum and for the institution should be a no-brainer, especially when you're working with the labor of people of color. And so it was a lot of like institutional learning curves and steps taken to start working with content and material like this that is sensitive. And I think one of the things that was really important to point out for them in my curatorial role was just the importance of taking the steps to do it. Of course, there will be stumbling along the way because no one is perfect and we're all humans, but taking the step is more important than not taking the step at all. And so the show was up until from October of 2021 until January of 2022. It came down, all the work went back home, everyone was happy, everyone was really excited. The show got a ton of visibility. I was really, really happy that at the opening, I had a lot of people come up to me, including board members of the institution, who said that they almost stayed home, that they didn't want to go because they did not want to be confronted with difficult material. But when they got there, they realized that it was not just difficult material, but it was how it was approached. It was how it was installed. And it was not necessarily a situation in which people were pointing fingers, but an exploration of identity, social justice, and race, more than anything. Thank you. Questions?
I had a question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm thinking about this a lot these days too, but this sort of mind-body dissonance, I'm curious in that moment where you decided to run. Like, is that an intuitive response? Is it something that you felt? Is it like a mental strategy? Like, I'm just kind of curious, you know, that the board member didn't want to put their physical body there.
Yeah.
They would have seen the work. Right?
Yeah.
Like, so, just kind of curious at that moment if that was like from the body or from the mind.
It was a little bit of both, honestly. I really don't like openings, and so it didn't surprise me that there was a lot of tension surrounding the opening. I mean, I think openings are just really hard anyway, and I'd much rather be at home. It's like you do so much work to get to the opening, and then you have to talk about it, right? And you're really exhausted. And so part of it was just kind of escaping a little bit. And then the other part of it was this performance, where it was, you know, creating a moment of humor, creating this moment of just like diffusing all of that stuff. And so yeah, part of it was like really considered, but I didn't realize how much it would diffuse that until the moment of. when I was actually like talking and like sweating and people were laughing and I was like having a hard time catching my breath. And it was this, I think it was really important to show people that I am also human and that this is all just, we're all figuring it out as we go along, right? And so it was one of those moments of like, yeah, we're doing this together right here in this space, where the institution is also taking that first step. So yeah, it worked out in a way that I didn't expect.
It's also invisible labor, right? And
Yeah.
the labor of people of color is invisible.
Right, exactly, exactly. I wasn't trying to hide that at all, yeah.
So Leslie, I have a question about the going into the community. Did it actually produce people getting interested in coming into the institution?
It did, it really did, and I think that there's a lot of people in the institution that aren't represented, right? Like, or that institution doesn't represent in the community of Amarillo itself, which actually is very Hispanic, very Latino. And the Amarillo Museum of Art is a white-led institution at the end of the day. And so I think that there were a lot of people that, like the security guard, for instance, was talking with the artist, and that was the first time that he had had someone or people that look like him or that can relate to his labor in any way in the institution, and that was incredible to me. And the artists that were there, because he got to talk with them. So yeah, in the end it did. I will say we didn't have many conversations after the show opened formally to know the extent of that work. Informally, my friend John and my friend Dina would tell me like, oh yeah, we had more visitorship, or this person was really interested in covering the show, or it's had more attendance than we've seen in the past for these biennials. But formally within the institution, that conversation didn't happen, unfortunately. But even in the night of the opening, there were just more people that were not represented by the institution in the past than were, if that makes any sense. Yeah, which was more important to me.
And which leads into my other question about, did you get any critical response at all?
No. The board members that came up to me during the opening said that they walked in and they thought they were going to be very critical. That they walked in and really felt that they were going to receive a lot of blame or feel like guilt, that they did not expect to relate to some of the work. Part of this show, yes, dealt with social justice and race and identity, but there was also issues like climate change and sort of climate change and like changing landscapes and gentrification, things like that. So that there was also something for people to relate to in terms of the landscape and geography of Amarillo, which was also important to me. I want to make sure that there's, entry points for people because this work is hard. So I think that a lot of people expected to be critical and then walked in and was like, oh, yeah, this is a good show. And that helps. It helps to work with a team that really knows their space. So yeah, I didn't receive as much critical or like negative feedback as I was expecting to receive. Mm-hmm.
I was actually asking that. Did it? Did not.
Oh.
But that was a good response.
Thanks. It did get written up. It did get written up in local Amarillo press, which was good. I don't remember if it got written up in Glass Tire, but if it didn't, that's fine. I think the local press is more important to me than the statewide press. Yeah, it did get written up in the local press. Mm-hmm.
When folks expected to be critical when they walked in, do you have a sense when they said that they weren't, so taken aback? Do you think messages got through to folks, or
yeah, they
was there a
did.
barrier?
They did, and I think part of that was just that they had a very different expectation of what the show was going to be. And then when they came in and saw that it was about various types of social justice, then I think it provided an entry point to more difficult conversations, which was the goal. Yeah. Yeah.
So what was the makeup of the audience? We talk about Amarillo being mostly Latino and brown, and the board of directors and leaders in the museum being mostly white.
Mm-hmm.
How was that? What was the audience makeup? Or was it just the board members that showed up? Or how was the outreach connected to the neighborhoods of the gente?
Do you mean the night of the opening?
Yes, and the rest of the time.
Yeah, the rest of the time I'm not sure. I don't live in Amarillo, so I wasn't really on the ground to see it every day. The night of the opening, though, was pretty balanced between patrons of the museum, some of the board members, And a lot of the artists came up from wherever they lived to be there for the opening, which was really great. So we had this like community within the show itself, which was really nice. And it was a lot of the artists didn't know each other, so they were all meeting for the first time, which was really cool. So it was pretty balanced. And what was great about that too is that the board members who were nervous about the show could actually meet the artists that were participating in the show. We also had a lot of people come up from Lubbock because there's a few of the artists like from the border did their grad school and grad work at Texas Tech. And so there was that community there that it kind of extended to. So it was a pretty balanced crowd of patrons, some older patrons, and then like really young artists that participated that were able to kind of engage with the patrons of the institution itself as well, which was really nice. So I didn't have to do all the work by myself. Any other questions? Yeah.
For institutions, like, what is your opinion on the role that they have in creating a safe space to have these conversations? Like, what do you think they could do better?
Oh, that's a big question. I'm really critical of museums. I think that museums offer a lot of lip service, and I don't think that they often follow through with that. I think that happens for a variety of reasons, and part of it is a lack of resources. I think that museums try to create safe spaces, but oftentimes don't really know how to do that effectively, and are also always at the service of their board and patrons as well, which is an unfortunate situation. And I think it does, institutions also kind of become their own sort of insular community, right? And so there is this idea that yes, you are achieving these goals, but the reality is very different. I think that museums oftentimes do rely on like visiting curators to kind of point out these chasms. And that was one of the things that I inadvertently did, apparently. I think that not all museums are sort of falling into that pattern. I think that a lot of them are, especially the bigger institutional ones. When I heard that this project was creating such a rift, I wasn't surprised, unfortunately. I think it is a responsibility of a museum to create a safe space, but the reality of that is very different. If that answers your question. Yeah.
I work for a museum as a docent,
Mm-hmm.
and I often think about what the role of the docent is in transferring these kinds of issues through art to the public. And quite often the docent core is the face of the museum and the public. And some museums have 70, 80 docents worth of them. What do you think of the role of the docent in all of that?
I think it's a really hard role. Gosh, it takes a lot of investment from that person, from the docent. I don't think that docents are often prepared enough to answer a lot of the questions. I also think that docents are taught, in bigger institution, docents are taught the role of art history, and have to then explain that art history or contextualize that art history to a museum visitor, but aren't allowed the freedom to talk about the work the way that they would be interested in talking about the work or in relating that to the person that's in front of them necessarily. Docents often are not paid. And so I think it's a lot of work and labor to ask of a docent to be able to be that interface with the institution. And I don't think that oftentimes the docents are under the education program and not the curatorial program. And oftentimes the education department and program does not talk to the curatorial department or program. And so the information comes down to the education department after the research and the work and the process has been done and the show is already up, usually, or at least close to up. And so, yeah, it's just, there's this sort of rift between the departments where like information just doesn't get filtered down and like the excitement of the project of the show doesn't necessarily reach the docents, and then that poor docent is the face of the institution. So I think it's a really tricky role. I really think it's a really tricky role, yeah. Anything else? Yes.
So I'm curious about the mission of the Amarillo Art Museum and how they can justify, there's the composition of the community, and a museum is an educational institution and also provides education. So how do they justify that lack of service, I guess? Or
I think that was where it was so tricky for them. honestly. I think that they were coming up against a situation in which they had a mission and a vision that said one thing and an institution that was doing another. And I think that this made it really clear, which happens a lot, honestly. Like, institutions don't often revisit their missions and histories, right? And so then you come up with something that is actually kind of antiquated and not really reflecting what it is that the institution is doing. And I think that this was that situation.
And what are their plans for future biennials?
I don't know, actually. I have no idea. My role was just to curate this one biennial, and they kind of like will put that in their archival box and walk away and then do the next one. So I really don't know what the next one's going to be. They might go back to doing something like subject matter. Yeah.
So your role as curator was to select the artists?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you did that without, there was no like committee or
Just
input
me.
from other people?
It was just me. Yeah, they usually only have one curator for these. Yeah.
And you said earlier that there was a fee, a registration fee, is that right?
Mhm.
So each of the artists who applied, and then those fees were then transferred to the artists who actually were chosen.
Exactly. Like, that created like a pocket of money for us to be able to pay people for the work to participate. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, most of them. I kept in touch with most of them. I usually do keep in touch with the artists that I work with on shows like this. A couple of the artists that were in the show I'd known for a long time. And there were some really young artists from the border, from Brownsville, that I hadn't met before. And so it was really fun to work with them and to think about what projects we can work on in the future as well. Yeah. Yeah, Kate.
One more question. So I think as institutions of many types, including museums, are confronted with the challenge of being more inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
It's true of higher ed too.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear what you're saying about you have institutional critique is really important, but I think even more challenging is how to come up with a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think museums can solve the problem of not being more equitable, inclusive, and diverse?
It's a big problem. I don't know if I can solve it.
Well, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
We're up against this brick wall because
Yeah.
we so much to diversify our audience, our board, our staff, and I mean, I'm not going to explain. So I just wanted to see if you have an idea of how to start.
I think like inviting different voices into the institution like this is a start, and I think it's a great start. I think that it really did point out a lot of areas in which the museum, Amarillo Museum of Art, could do better, and where they're not, and could easily do better. They could have educated their board members better, for example. And I think a lot of the response from that was just that there was a general fear of what they were getting into. I think that it's always important for institutions to bring in outside voices. It just widens the pool. And I think that's a great place to start. Mm-hmm. I don't work in a museum, but I haven't worked in a museum in a long time. But I do know that that was one of the things that happened when I was working in a museum, is that we were so buried with our own work that it was really difficult to like think beyond that work. And when you have like institutional burnout, when you've been in a place for a really long time, when you have limited resources and you're just trying to make things work, then it becomes really difficult to think and look beyond that. And that's where I think visiting people and visiting voices can help with that.
Was there a catalog or any way did the museum archive what happened?
There wasn't, unfortunately. There really wasn't. We did have like a print piece that was printed for the exhibition, but it wasn't more than a text and a few works of the art in the show. And I did check the website. They haven't updated it with the entire checklist, unfortunately. And so that is kind of just like in my archives, actually.
Do you plan on like doing anything with that?
Yeah, it'll go on my website eventually. I just haven't gotten to the point of updating my website yet, because none of us like doing that. Yeah, but it will live there with the entire list of artists and links to their websites as well, and photos of the show, which I haven't even. These photos are actually taken by one of the artists in the show. I haven't even gotten the images from the institution yet, which I've asked for. Yeah.
And your website is?
LeslieMoodyCastro.com. Just my name. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you think being an independent curator is the benefit of getting to go to these different institutions
Can you repeat the question, Chana?
Do you think that being an independent curator gives you an advantage of being that outside voice to these institutions?
Repeat questions for the Zoom folks.
Do I think that being a visiting curator gives me an advantage?
Yeah,
To these outside.
bringing those outside perspectives and narratives into institutions.
I don't know if it's an advantage necessarily, but I think it helps. I think because I've been freelance and independent since 2012, so I've worked in a lot of different institutions as like a visiting curator, and in a lot of different settings and places as an invited curator. And so I think what I can offer is not only a way to kind of be a different voice, but also offer different sort of perspectives. Like, oh, this institution and this other place did this, and maybe it could work for you as well. And that's also just fun. I like doing that, and I like being kind of like a connector in that way as well. And so I don't know if it's an advantage, but it's definitely fun.
I have a question about
Yeah.
finances.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the artist house in my area, I don't know if we can all try not to forget, but I'm kind of wondering, the institution also contribute to that amount? The shipping is expensive.
Shipping's expensive. I didn't choose anything that was particularly difficult to ship, and I also talked with the artists before we settled on the final checklist. There were a couple of larger pieces that I did want to include, but I made sure I reached out to the artists and asked them if they were okay with it. We also had plenty of time for shipping, so nothing needed to be sent like overnight. I think the artist got somewhere in the range of like $200 to $250. I honestly can't remember. And that was all handled on the institutional side, so I never saw the money moving. Yeah, but I was very I wanted to make sure. We even had actually an artist whose work was damaged, and he couldn't ship it in time for the show, and was looking to overnight it, and it was going to cost somewhere in the range of $1,000. We were like, no. Just get it to us when you can get it to us. If it's not, the opening is only one night. There's 2 months of a show left. Like whenever it can arrive, it can arrive. It's okay. So we worked really closely with the artists as well, where we could.
I'm also curious of your thoughts about, I believe it's free admission to the Amarillo Museum of Art. I'm wondering if, when they were talking with you, the staff were talking with you about developing the exhibition, if they were talking about public programming, any ways to get folks in. Do you have a sense that that free admission really helps?
I think it does. It's definitely an economically underdeveloped area, and so I do think it does help in bringing people in, or at least enticing people to go in. Yeah, I definitely think it does. And I actually wasn't involved in the conversations about programming during the exhibition. Like, my role was very clear. And it wasn't even until I was on the ground that I realized that there were these complexities and complications with the board happening, and I found out through hearsay. And so there was also like a little bit of a communication breakdown happening, which happens. Yeah. So I wasn't part of the programming stuff at all. Yeah. Any other questions up there? Yes.
In regards to your collaboration performatively with David Alcantara.
He's a very good friend, by the way.
Yeah. This may not be a serious question, but he is also a tattoo artist.
Yes.
Do you consider that collaboration to be? Yes. I have a lot in common with you. I have curated him as his Superman piece over a year ago now. Coming March, or this March, and we went to Austin together, where he was somewhat censored on the grounds. I was documenting his run, but they didn't allow a pole on the compound. So his flag pole was taken away. So I convinced him to use it as a cape. Flag. So we did the runs that way. And I also have one of his tattoos.
Yeah, I got the tattoo. A lot happened on the Texas Biennial road trip. I got the tattoo during the Biennial road trip as well. So it was a milestone for a lot of firsts that came later. Yeah. Yeah, he's a good friend. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is your role as a visiting curator, is that normal to have just that role and not be in connection with the other parts? Is that how it usually works?
I think it's different at every organization and institution, honestly. I am totally interested in collaborating with all different departments. And so I always tell people, just, here's the idea, great, put me to work. I really like collaborating a lot, and I think every curator has their own method and has their own way that they work, and so does every institution. And so it's just kind of like finding the right fit within that. Yeah. Any other questions? It's okay. That's what we're here for.
So what was your process of, when you were selecting the artists, what kind of process did you go through?
This is what kind of process did I go through in selecting artists?
Like, what were you thinking of when you were selecting them? Like trying to find like more established artists, or balance between established artists and new artists, or when you thought like that's it, it has to be here?
When I do these selection processes, I look at the work. I don't start with the artist name, I just look at the work. And it takes like 2 or 3 passes to actually kind of make the final selection. It's difficult because anyone up here can tell you, we all want everyone to be involved. Like, we don't want to say no. So it's a really hard process, but I always start with the work and kind of look at like the technical medium first, and then sort of make decisions and kind of make quick decisions to lower the application pool. And then from there, it gets more and more complicated. And then it becomes about like, will this work fit or like be a good piece in conversation with this work? Like, in an installation, can they actually work together? And I really don't actually pay attention to like the CV of the artist until much later on, honestly. I'm really not as interested in someone's like status as I am with building a really complete and cohesive show.
So what are your practices at expanding your pool of artists that you include into shows and future possibilities that you run?
My process? I do studio visits everywhere I go, all the time. Studio visits are really, really important to me. And honestly, secret, not so secret. If an artist asks me to come to their studio and visit their studio, I will not say no, unless I'm actually not in the city. If I cannot make it work logistically, then I can't do it, right? But I do studio visits everywhere I go. And that kind of just lives in this like Rolodex in my head. And I'm very visual, so I take notes with my phone all the time. And I just always have these like running, my camera rolls look crazy. I just like running photos of like artist studio visits that I've done in the past. Like sometimes it's, this artist that I met in Cairo, for example, like would be really good to introduce Sarah. And then it's like making those connections happen that then like turn into other opportunities. Yeah. It's organic. Is that it? Thank you.
Leslie, thank you. I think we're having a break for some snacks now, and there's artists at 8:08. They set up some appointments for some studio things. And we'll come back in about 45 minutes to an hour or so. So we'll see you shortly. Outside first, upstairs.
Yeah. It's recording.
I think I'm learning a little bit, but not,
See?
I'm not going to guarantee I know
See?
what I'm doing, but I don't think I know.
I got you. You just got to move the Zoom thing down. There it goes. And I'm just going to go ahead and, oh yeah, we need to put you back where you were. Leslie. Leslie. All right. So you are ready when you hit the right arrow. It'll go to Vicki. Yes. Okay. And then this is on. Test. You're starting what?
I put his image back. Like the rest of it. I put his mouse in that place.
Oh, okay. Perfect. All right. You are good.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice break and some delicious snacks upstairs. And those people who are in the Zoom world, hello. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Benito Huerta. Benito is a professor and the gallery director at the gallery at the University of Texas in Arlington, where he's been the director since 1997. He's a co-founder and executive director of Art Lies, a significant journal in Texas that was around for many years. He curates lots of shows currently in Arlington is the Melchin exhibition. He has artwork in galleries and in public arts projects throughout Texas. Recently, in 2002, he received the Dallas Center for Contemporary Arts Legend of the Year Award. It's nice being a legend. So congratulations, Benito. And he has work of his own in lots of places, as I say, and curating many exhibits. And it's being a gallery director at UT Arlington and me being a gallery director here, I kind of feel like I'd like to think of myself as a junior Benito. So, thank you, Benito.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for inviting me. I do want to say also that a few years ago, Scott curated a show of mine. How long ago was that? About
15 years ago?
Yeah,
something like that.
Yeah, when I actually had hair.
And I had black curly.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you for inviting me to do this. There was a question about, we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. And so I know about diversity, I know about inclusion or the lack of inclusion, but I wanted to see what the definition of equity meant. And it says in the dictionary, the quality of being fair and impartial. I find that that would be the perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. We don't have equity. We try to strive for that, but it's always feels like you're moving ahead and then you move back, and then moving ahead and move back. So it's kind of that kind of situation. The other thing that was kind of brought up about what we do is, and having the experience that we have is that we gain wisdom. It's kind of yes and no. I always think that it's actually more important to be kind of naive and to be a fool at times, because otherwise you may not try things that are new and different. And maybe from that you gain some wisdom, and hopefully learn from that. But I just want to explain this piece. This is a piece, because I actually did not submit any images. So Scott unknowingly told me he was going to put something up. So this piece is a recent piece. It's called Shades of Brown, and then in parentheses, value scale. So it's about, as you know, being another Latino, Latinx, Chicano, Mexican, Hispanic, Latin American, person of color. It's all the things that I've been described as. So before we get too far, I'm not talking about any one exhibition. I'm going to be talking about obstacles in a way that popped up throughout my career mostly as a curator, and occasionally as an artist. I am an artist, as you see, but one of the things I think is important as a curator is to think about to be aware of what's going on in the area, and in the country, and in the world, and how that affects artists who make things, and then how they respond, and then how to present them in an exhibition. But before I get started again, I want to say that I want to talk about coconut pie. I love coconut pie. And we actually were driving from Arlington, we went through 281 through Marble Falls. And unfortunately, one of my favorite places is Bluebonnet Cafe, because they have all kinds of pie. And they have some meringue pies that are like, the meringue's about 3 or 4 inches. I mean, it's amazing. And so I thought, it'd be nice to get a piece of pie. And usually we stop by there when it's open, but it was after hours, and we got into San Antonio late. And, but in my story, we're actually there. And I order a whole coconut pie. And I'm thinking I'm going to cut a slice, and then I'm going to take it, and then again, this is just a story. I'm going to take it back home and share it with friends and my wife. And although she doesn't eat the crust because she's gluten sensitive, so, but I'll eat the crust too. But I thought, well, if I eat another piece, because I like coconut pie, I might want another piece, because that usually happens. But if I do that, that means somebody else is not getting a piece. So, so I think about that in this story. So all of a sudden, the Bluebonnet Cafe's door is just slammed down, and all of a sudden, Putin's there. And he's eyeing my pie, the whole coconut pie. And I know that he's not there for just a slice. He wants the whole pie. And it's like, wait a minute, this is my pie. It's not his pie. And then I hear all these protesters in this neighborhood protesting the fact that he went to another neighborhood to get somebody else's pie, and he's not providing any pies for his own people. So obviously he's not inclusive and doesn't care about the diversity factor, and obviously doesn't give a damn about equity. So I tell this story because in a sense, the art world's kind of like that too sometimes. And these are the kinds of things that I found throughout my travels as a curator and artist. I do want to say that, for those of you who know Chuck Bermudez's work, he did a photograph of a coconut, open and whole and cracked. Because coconut, that term's been used to describe Latinos who are brown on the outside and white on the inside. So, the terminologies are kind of be loaded at times too. One of the things that I found out a few years ago was that the majority of artists who have one-person museum shows are represented by less than 10 galleries. And that's in the country. I'm not talking about San Antonio or Texas, I'm talking about the country. So, and I know those artists who are getting those shows, they're diverse. They have all kinds of great work that they're doing, and it's not about that, it's about power. Because in the end, it's like, that's what we're actually really dealing with, is power. And some of the things that come up in the previous discussions has dealt with that aspect. So I found myself invited in 2003, or was it, no, actually 2012. The current director of the Dallas Museum of Art invited me. I guess I was the only one in Arlington that was invited, and I don't think anybody from Fort Worth came, to a collector's home in North Dallas to talk about the Dallas Museum and how it's perceived by the public. In this case, it was mostly artists with a few collectors and a few galleries. And when we got there, it turns out that they were talking about the positive aspects and positive experiences that the people who were in the attendance had had with the Dallas Museum. And I just missed that part of it. And then the next question was, did anybody have any negative experiences? And I looked around the room and I thought, well, I have a problem. And there was more than just one problem, I have to say. But one of the problems that I brought up, or issues I brought up, is that I said, some of the artists in this room who are already in their 60s, or maybe even older, or maybe slightly younger, but a lot of these artists who are showing nationally and internationally have yet to have a show at the Dallas Museum. And they live in Dallas. I don't. You know, I live in Arlington. It doesn't bother me. So I feel like this is sometimes the thing, and I really complain about this aspect when I used to live in Houston, which is I really consider my second hometown. And I always made this complaint, is like that your local institutions aren't supporting their artists. And I'm not saying that they should just give them an exhibition. I think the work should be good quality and should be dealing with issues, and the craftsmanship should be good. But they're showing internationally. They should be showing here. I gave an example of whether you like the work or not of Nick Nicosia. He was having a show at the Contemporary Arts Museum in Houston. It wasn't going to travel anywhere. And he was a Dallas photographer mostly, but he does artwork, drawings and other stuff with sculpture now. And I brought it up to the director and said, you know, this show ended up going to the Dallas Museum only because some of the board members who own his work said, we need to have this show up here. That's how that show came up to the Dallas Museum. It wasn't because it was planned. It was a reaction from the board members who have a say in what happens at the museum. Although they try to stay out of these curatorial matters, but that doesn't really happen. You know, it's like they're involved. The other person at the same time I'll mention is Linda Ridgway. She had a show that was a part of the Glassell School at the Museum of Fine Arts, and she had a show there, and the same thing happened with her show. It wasn't going to be traveling, so the Dallas Museum took it on again because the board member said, we collect her work. She's a great artist. We should show her work. That's how that happened. So that's one aspect that about some of the discussion. One of the things that the director said, well, maybe you should curate a Hispanic show. Oh, okay, I didn't really want to curate a show. I just want to bring up these issues because it affects all of us, not just me. But I did ask Janet, my wife who's here, on the way home, I said, how many people of color did you see in attendance? This is between 40 and 50 people. Only one person, and that was me. It felt like a token again. It's like, I don't mind it because I've gotten used to it. I do mind it when it's the police. Because I've been stopped probably too many times that I still look around the back of my car to see if I'm being followed by a police car at times. Anyway, in 2003, I was asked to participate in this with the University of Texas Press. They got an endowment that was called the Georgia Hegarty Dunkerley Contemporary Art Series. And what the endowment was for, to actually publish monographs on Texas artists. And there were several of us who were acting as advisors. But one of the things I immediately suggested is that I know that, because I know it's going to happen, I said, you know, you're going to have the people who are already well known from Texas and outside of Texas. And but maybe in between those artists, we should have other artists of color in there. And I suggested, well, actually the series ended up being that they published. I don't know that they're publishing anymore. Melissa Miller, James Drake, Gail Stack, Vernon Fisher, Nick Nicosia, and Terry Allen. And right before, I think the Terry Allen book got, I emailed the current editor, because it was a different editor from when we started the whole process. And I said, when are you gonna have an artist of color in there, in that series? Because otherwise, when you publish this series, and right now it's only all white artists, women as well as men. And I said, people are going to think that Texas is either a racist state, or there are no artists of color in Texas. So I think that, and when I suggested some of the people like Luis Jimenez, Celia Munoz, John Biggers, Cesar Martinez, Mel Chen. I actually suggested Mel Chen for the first book. The reason is that he's really an international artist, deals with a lot of big issues, and it'll be unexpected because it's not white or brown or black, but an Asian. And I thought this would be a good way to start the series, and then kind of like sandwich in other artists, but it didn't happen. So we have now the current series that deals with those artists that I've just mentioned. So this is a really, to me, a serious issue because exhibitions are important, but it's not enough. The next project that I got involved with is in 1997. Kathy Vargas, who's from here in San Antonio, who I've known for a long time. I've shown her work in her gallery. Victor Zamudio Taylor collaborated with Henry Estrada, and we were asked to curate a show at the Laguna Gloria Museum at the Austin, for the Austin Museum. And we were, at some point, decided to do, each of us will do individual exhibition within Laguna Gloria, which is not a big museum. I ended up getting the entry gallery, which is a nice sized space. And what I wanted to do was something a little different. So one of the show contained was, there was four walls, and in one wall, I had borrowed a Jasper Johns print from, at that time, it was the Huntington Museum. I think it's now the Blanton Museum. Because Jasper Johns, a well-known, well-respected artist, and his work I like a lot, was having a retrospective of the modern at that time. They just closed another one recently of his work, not at the Modern, but at a couple of other museums. And on another wall, I borrowed a Robert Henry Askin School painting that the museum owned itself, and I put that up on another wall. And then I borrowed a black velvet painting that a friend of mine had of Elvis. Because you see a lot of black velvet paintings that people own. And then on the fourth wall, I did salon style, invited as many artists, Latino artists, to show their work salon style. Now, I did think of all the other artists in the rest of the show as being part of this, but it was in a sense what I was trying to say was, these are the things in the other three walls that are being collected. This is not being collected, and it's overwhelming of the amount of work that's being created and not being, not just exhibited, but collected. That's the other layer besides exhibitions that is important. So, and that was happening at the time that I was curating a show, 30-year retrospective of Luis Jimenez at the Dallas Museum that ended up traveling through Exhibits USA. So part of that was for me was that I got to see what the Dallas Museum's collection had. I was part of this mural program at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston in '96, and got to also see what their collection was, as well as the Austin Museum. And I realized, except for the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, that there was a lack of representation of Latino and Latino artists. And I know that the Dallas Museum had shown an artist from Dallas at the time. He's actually from San Antonio and moved back since that time. He had a show at the Dallas Museum in '91. His name is John Hernandez. And they actually bought a piece of his, a really large and really beautiful piece that's in their collection. So the other thing that happened was in it was about 2012, I think. There was, and I remember Vicki being there. There was a panel discussion at the National Sculpture Center called Off the Pedestal, Women Artists in Art Museums. Linda Beckless was there, Connie Butler was chief curator of the Hammer Museum, Elizabeth Sackler, president of the Arthur M. Sackler Foundation, Jenny Sorkin, assistant professor of contemporary art history at University of California, Santa Barbara, and Lee Arnold, who's the moderator, and at that time, I think, assistant curator at the National, she's now associate. I think this was a great panel in the sense that they were talking about women in museums practices. And one of the things that I would say that's really good about Metroplex, a lot of the major museums at that time had a woman curator. Right now, I know that the chief curator is Andrea Carnes. The chief curator at the Emmett Carter is Shirley Reese Hughes. The chief curator of the Dallas Museum is Catherine Robeck. And the chief curator at the Crow Collection, which is of Asian art, is Jacqueline Chow. This is the chief curator. So you have these women who are in very important positions. Now, the Modern is the only one who has a woman as a director of the museum. But what this was, and I thought the discussion was great, but the only thing that was lacking, that there was no women of color on that panel. And again, we were making progress, but we still need to make more progress. Because I do think that people of color, when they're representing, in a sense, that voice, know things about their cultural background community that some of these other curators do not. And so you're really widening the perspective of what the museums are doing. Now, going back to my role as director and curator for the gallery at UTA, as I mentioned, one of the things that I've been critical of museums is the fact that they don't sometimes show people in their own area. But when I moved to Arlington in 1997, there was an artist who I met in 1985 who was in a couple of shows that I've curated. One was called Sur Fronteras. It was a contemporary art of contemporary Hispanic artists in Texas. And that's when I met Celia Alvarez Munoz. And she lives in Arlington. And so one of the things I said was, like, I really want to do, I can't do a retrospective because our gallery is not big. It's 4,000 square feet. But I'd like to do a survey of the work of photography and text, which was what was she known for. She's done public art, and there's a piece that she did a piece downtown here, as well as she was like the head public art coordinator for the convention center, Henry Gonzalez Convention Center, and was helping a hand in selecting other artists to be part of that public art program. So I asked her if I could curate a show for work, and I would try to raise some money to do a catalog and to actually try to tour the show. She's well known, and she was in the Whitney Biennial in 1991. She's in several museum collections, and she's still in museum exhibitions as well. So it seemed like a natural thing to do, and we've had this friendship over a number of years, knew her work very well. And actually, the show, as I was organizing, Blue Star here wanted to include that, but also include a installation piece of hers about the missing woman in Juarez. So that was included in the show at Blue Star, as well as that she was commissioned. I don't remember the organization that commissioned her, but she was commissioned to photograph well-known Latinos and for their collection. And that series of work was also shown. And then we brought up the show that I curated into our space, and then we got it to travel. I did send information out to many museums outside that have shown her work, and not one major museum wanted to pick up on it. And she has yet to this day have a retrospective of her body of work. As far as our gallery is concerned, as other things, because I am an artist and this is kind of brought up, is that we actually take care of shipping both ways, because I know as an artist that you pay a lot of money to make the work, you spend a lot of time making the work, and it's like I don't want to add another financial burden on the artist, so I said we'll take care of the shipping both ways as much as we can, because we do have a limited budget. We also have an honorarium for all our artists. They usually try to be the same. It depends if they're in the region or from outside, and so it might vary to cover some travel expenses. We do brochures for exhibition because as an artist, I believe it's real important that the exhibition gets documented. It's gotten cheaper because of digital printing, so it's really affordable. But the problem is that print material is becoming not as important to a younger audience. It's all on your phone, you know? But one of the things I have to say as an aside, I teach a professional practices class, and one of the assignments is that they have to go off campus to critique an exhibition, and it cannot be a UTA faculty or student, and it has to be in a museum or commercial gallery or nonprofit. And this last semester, I had a sculpture major who went to the Nasher to do a critique of the exhibition that was there. The Nasher Sculpture Center, it was her first time to that center in the 4 years that she was at UTA. I mean, this is not indicative of her, it's indicative of a lot of people. It's like, it's on the phone or in the computer. You don't have to see art now, but you do have to see art. It's important. It's an experience. I will say that that when the murder of George Floyd happened and the protests happened, it was a lot of things that I've been talking about. There was a seismic shift in our view of what was happening in our country and how people have been treated. This is not the first time it's been treated like, people of color have been treated like this. It's just that for some reason, going back to the phone, it was recorded live. And it happened. And all of a sudden, in downtown Dallas, in the area, there was protests. And the protests went through the Cultural District, which is the Dallas Museum of Art, the Nasher, and the Crow Collection. And the Nasher's windows were broken. And there was a bookstore, a gift shop there. And what they ended up doing, which I thought was great, was that when they replaced the windows, they decided at that point to show artists from the community and have rotating exhibitions. I think, and they're still doing that, and I think it was a great response, but it's like, sometimes I wish it was happened before all this. Forces people to change. And it's, for me, sometimes it's how long will this change last? I hope it's permanent, and I'm not saying just for the Nasher, but this whole mindset, because it gets tiresome when you're seeing those kinds of images that, you know, it's one thing to see what's happening in Ukraine, which is a tragedy, it's a horrible tragedy. But it's another thing when this happens in this country, you know? So the power structure is, the thing is, for me, it's not only, exhibitions is on the surface. Collections, and then who makes the decisions about those things? And I still think that we still have a long ways to go to have people of color, as well as the women that are already there, to be making those decisions. That's how you strive to have a better world. That's how you strive to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Very interested in your concept of power and how that works. How do you feel that art plays into the criticism and at the same time the necessity for power? I mean, power is one, and on one side of it is how you get things done. Yes. On the other side of it is abuse. And
Is what?
abuse,
Yes.
that is to say, or insensitivity or ignorance or whatever. And I wonder how art helps that, you bridge that.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's about when somebody has power, it's how do you deal with that? And then there's an abuse of power. And then that's correct. I mean, power does get abused. I think that coming from my perspective in my role as a curator, and I actually didn't set out to become a curator. To be honest with you, I wanted to just be an artist. And somebody was asking me, well, how did you end up curating? Well, when I was in undergraduate school, I was making art. And then I said, well, after I was making art, I said, what do you do with it now? Because I didn't know anything about curating. I didn't know about collections or any of that stuff. I fell asleep during art history class. Yes, art history. But Scott, I'm sure you're a great art history teacher. So it's not a critique of you. But I'm sure you're great, because some of the people you're working with, they love you. I think you're great. I love you. You're a wonderful person. And you're a great teacher. So, but because I've been witness to the things that I've described, I want to strive to change that. As far as being director of the gallery, I'm very conscientious of like who I'm showing and what I'm showing. The work comes first for me. It's still important that it's really strong work. But I also think it's like, who am I showing? And I remember that somebody on the faculty told another faculty member who told me, like, this other person was kind of getting upset because I was showing more Latino artists. And when I heard this, the two artists I was showing were both white. So I'm very conscious of this, but it's that part of it for me is that the history that I've had of curating for almost 45 years is that I know a lot of artists. I see a lot of work. I try to, whenever I'm in places like San Antonio, I try to go see exhibitions and try to be aware of what's happening. And so I try to make sure that we're doing these kinds of things in our gallery, to have a representation, to make sure that we have a diverse exhibition schedule, make sure that we are impartial and fair, and include people that have been excluded. But we also have a situation where we allow for our other faculty to curate shows, and I'm my assistant director, acts as backup support for them, and whatever their ideas, I don't try to censor work, and I don't try to guide them. It's at their exhibition, they curated, and we put their name onto the exhibition. But I think it's important that I'm not the only one, and to make sure we even have diverse voices from within. So I think that you have to be conscientious of what's happened before. I'm, again, being maybe sometimes naive and maybe kind of a fool, but I believe in the power of art. I don't know that it will deter revolutions, deter invasions, but I think that it could influence how one thinks about one's life and maybe enriches that life as well.
Benito, do you have any mentees that you're especially proud of, that you've been mentoring in curation or even in the realm of printmaking that you're strong in, that you would like to speak to all of us about?
I guess I don't think about the people that I might have influenced as an artist or as a curator. I just try to do what I can do. It's always surprising when somebody comes up to me and says, thank you for what you said or did. And it's surprising sometimes, because sometimes you think that when you're doing what you do as a curator, as an artist, or even as a human being, that somebody comes up to you later and says, thank you, and what you said really meant a lot to me. And it always takes me by surprise, because sometimes you think you're just talking to the wind, but I find that some people are listening. And then there's some people who also, don't agree with you. And I try to listen to them as well, because maybe I can learn something about myself that I didn't know. So.
We can have some more questions during our roundtable discussion. That would be great. We're just looking at thank you.
Yes, sure.
Our next speaker is Vicki Meek. Vicki, like Benito, Vicki, here's the microphone. Vicki, like Benito, is an artist and a curator, an independent curator. She also has many years of experience as an arts administrator. For 20 years, she was the manager of the South Dallas Cultural Center. She's also a writer, working for the Dallas Weekly as well. She has been, her art was collected in collections across Texas and the country. She is I have your title, what is your title here? I'm never going to get that right. I'll give you one of her titles that I can get right. She is an appointment from the Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson's at-large appointment to the Arts and Culture Commission in Dallas. And Vicki, like Benito, has many works in public arts. We have the great opportunity to meet with Vicki and to hear a little bit about her work as an artist and as a curator. Thank you. So I can start here.
All right, so let me give you a little context. He's going to show a video of my last just closed installation because he insisted that I have to show my art. So, all right, let's go. And that'll speak for itself.
My name is Vicki Meek, and I'm an artist, and I live in Dallas, Texas. Houston is my art. I started making art when I was 8 years old in Philadelphia, that's where I'm from, and I started getting formal art lessons at 8. I was trained as a sculptor. I got my BFA in sculpture from Tyler School of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and then I got my MFA in sculpture at University of Wisconsin in Madison. This show, The Journey to Me, which is here in the Art League of Houston, is an exploration actually of my trajectory as far as an artist is concerned. My biggest inspiration was Elizabeth Catlett. She was a sculptor, African-American woman from DC, and she did work that was both political and racial. So that was a very big influence on what I decided to do as an artist, and so my work has always been political. But as this show indicates, I went from being like overtly political to beginning to look at the work through a sort of spiritual lens once my children were born. So you kind of track my progression in that way through this exhibition. When Art League of Houston informed me that I was the 2021 Texas Artist of the Year, they said, well, you're going to have an exhibition. And I thought, okay, great, I've been doing installation for over 40 years, so I thought I would do an installation. And they said, well, you're going to have all 3 galleries. So that's a little different. And so I started thinking about that. I said, if I have 3 galleries, then I should really take this as an opportunity to explore all of what I've been doing over the years. And so that's how it came to be The Journey to Me. And I started looking at, I think people would be kind of interested in, what was my aesthetic development and how did that grow over the years. And I started thinking about the galleries being connected as opposed to 3 separate galleries with 3 separate conversations going on. So all 3 of these galleries are linked by the conversation that's happening on the walls. Well, I always hope that viewers take away something about history, because my work is rooted in understanding Black history. I'm always hoping that the audience will be more interested and look into some of the things that I'm putting out there for them to explore. I'm always hoping that they will understand that I'm creating healing spaces for the most part in terms of the work that I'm doing, especially when I think of ancestor groups, which, this is the space that I'm in now. There's my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, my grandfather, my parents on the tapestry. And then behind us is Ancestral Yard, so to speak. You know, it's got peat moss on the ground, which is a healing element. The roosters represent ancestors. The blue color is a protection color. That's why the room is blue. That's why the rooster's feet are blue. Yeah, everything that I do is symbolic. I mean, you can assume when you're looking at my work that the colors mean something, that the materials are all about something in specific. I'm basically trying to do the same thing that traditional African art does. Traditional African art is always symbolic. It always has meaning. It's never done just for the sake of doing something pretty. It's about communicating something that the community will understand because of the symbols that are used. Those are the spaces that I really want people to just be able to reflect on humanity and what it means to be a human being and connected to other human beings.
Hi, I am Michelle Barnes. I'm an
Isn't that, I love that video. Isn't that great?
Okay, so this is a show that I curated for women. So my name is Vicki Meek. I'm the curator for the exhibition. We know who we are, we know what we want. And it's an exhibition of 9 women whose work all speaks to all aspects of feminism and humanism. These are artists that I was interested in. I'm interested in them as human beings and also interested in the practice that they are engaged in. We have to know where we've been in order to know where we're going. The works of the artists that you see in here, many of these women are in fact looking at their historical roots as the motivation for the conversation that I engage with. When moving into work approached me about curating, I started thinking, as I'm sure everybody is at this moment in time, about, well, what would you want to put out there for the public to see? I think when they asked me, it was right when there was a lot of debate about what was going to happen now that David Ginsburg was dead. And I was thinking about the fact that American women are going backwards as far as our rights are concerned. I think we cannot minimize how precarious our position is right now in this country, 100 years after celebrating the 19th Amendment. One of the most interesting things about this show is the way in which these women have used a variety of media. The videos that we are showing are videos that are referencing things that have to do with the sort of historical placement of women in those particular societies. We have digital media, digital prints, and then Angela Fox is doing constructive works, combination of mixed media constructions along with traditional print. So all of that is the kind of conversation that I wanted to have around feminism. What are women doing? Women are doing everything. There are so many different mediums that artists are working with in this show. Everything from Rahab's gauze and the way in which she envisions the gauze in interplay with light, because that's a critical part of the nature is a critical part of her work, to the metalworks that Naomi's doing here that reference really salvaging, but then taking that salvage and doing something with it that is unexpected, to basic clay that Pat Johnson is using, all of that I was very interested in. There are women doing work all over the world that is strong and important and impactful.
First off, let me thank you, Scott, for inviting me to be a part of this. Thank you, Aïssatou, for recommending me to him. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. So, I just noticed that little African, did I do that?
I think so.
Okay, I did that. Sometimes I forget what I put in things. So what I wanted to talk about, because actually many of the things that I wanted to comment on have been commented on by my predecessors speaking to you. So I want to focus on a couple of things that haven't really been talked about. And one of those is the idea that there is somehow a failure on the part of the institutions to really embrace this notion of inclusion. And I believe very firmly that one of the hardest things to do is to create institutional change. Because so many of the problems are systemic. They are problems that are rooted in the notion that there is really one way to look at art that's better than others, and whether that's spoken or not, it may never be spoken because that's like overtly racist. But that is in fact the mindset. Because when you can talk about, for instance, Benito being asked to curate a Latino show, when he's the only Latino in the room, not to curate a show of his choosing, but, oh, he's a Latino, so, hey, you want to curate a Latino show? That's the kind of thing that we have to begin to understand perpetuates that whole idea of there being one way to look at art as being important and all the others are subordinates. This particular show that I did, I've had a long relationship with women in their work for years. I was shown there a couple of times. I've been on their advisory committee for a couple of times, and so I have a long relationship with them going back to the early 90s. But it was interesting to me that when I chose, because they gave me free rein, they said, would you like to curate our inaugural show for our new space? And I was like, sure, that'd be great. And they gave me free rein to do whatever I wanted, which I appreciated. So I did not have a call for artists. This was a show that I chose the artists that I wanted to be in the show based on what I knew their work was about. So with the exception of, I think, one artist whose work I was not extremely familiar with, that was Pat Johnson, the only white woman in the show. Sorry about that. But her work was very compelling. I had seen her work. I was interested in her as an artist. And so I went and did more research on her. And when I did that, I was sure I wanted her in the show. But all of these women were women who I had either shown before or shown with, and was very interested in the kinds of conversations they were having. Ironically, every one of them had applied to women in their work to show there and had never been accepted. So I thought that was an interesting sort of dialogue, I had chosen women who actually knew what woman in Texas doesn't know about women in their work. But they'd never been shown in that space. So, I put the show together and, is it going? Oh, no, don't do it yet. Okay. Okay, you said okay. Good, here we go. I put the show together, and when work got installed, I think there were several comments made about, wow, who are these women? These are very interesting work that they do. And I said, well, they're not a mystery. They've been in Texas. They've all been working very diligently, and we started getting these really great reviews on the show. I mean, we got amazing reviews on the show, and every one of those reviews talked about what an amazing body of work this show was made up of. And I realized that part of what all of us have to do is to push far beyond what we might be comfortable with, and open up to some things that, there was some work in this show that I didn't necessarily understand all of it, But in talking to the artists, began to realize, well, this is pushing my understanding of feminism, beyond what I thought it was. Because every single one of these women was dealing with an aspect of feminism that came specifically from their culture, which I was not a part of. So there was no way for me to make a value decision on whether or not that voice was a valid voice for feminism. It was valid because this woman coming out of this experience said that's what her reality was. And all of those conversations worked so well together. We have one of the artists here now, Lauren Cross was in the show. All of those conversations, when I put them all together, they were having a really robust conversation around what it meant to be a woman in the 21st century in America and in other places. Because most of the, I would say, 3/4 of the women were immigrants. And not, even that term, when you hear immigrant, most people think Latinx or Latino, something from some Spanish-speaking place. But we have immigrants from all over the world living in Texas. And in my case, I picked a woman like Pahlavi's Indian. Nita is from Iran. All of these people are living in Texas, however, they're all Texans now. Although we all know you're never a Texan unless you were born here, so that much I know. And Naomi is from Kenya. So all of them had these very unique takes on what it was like to be a woman in this country and how their native country affected their take on that. And I just found that to be a very compelling conversation to have in the 21st century in America at this moment when we as American women are fighting to remain full human beings, fully in charge of our bodies, fully in charge of our rights. I thought, wow, we were always talking about, those poor third world women, and they're being subjugated to all kinds of, and here we are fighting for our basic rights that we thought we'd already gotten. So all of those kinds of things really kind of colored the way in which I put this exhibition together, which, could have been done, I could have easily have just sort of done it under the traditional term feminism and how we understand it. But that would not have in any way moved the conversation forward in my mind as we talk about what does feminism mean in the 21st century. So that's how I curated this particular show. So I've curated other shows. What did I do? That was the most recent, because that just opened last year. Is it not moving forward? Okay, all right, here we go. So I'm going to show you a couple of other ways in which I've put together shows. I ran, as Scott said.
Got that across the top.
What do you do?
Can you just click and drag it down?
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, they can read it, right? You can read it, yeah. This, by the way, is what happens to me with technology all the time. It never cooperates with me, ever.
I teach it. It doesn't cooperate with me
Well,
either.
there you
You
go.
just learn to accept it. Thank you for letting us accept
I've just always thought it was personal.
it. I'm letting you know it's not.
Right. Very good. So as Scott said, I ran the South Dallas Cultural Center for 20 years, and we have a gallery there, and I was the curator as well as the director of the center, which was a wonderful, wonderful thing for me to be, because I actually love curating. Not as much as I love making art, but I love curating. And it allowed me to do many things for the Dallas area that had not been done, and that was to have a really viable contemporary art exposure to African American artists. The center itself is an African-centered facility, and I was able to curate a number of, I don't know how many shows over the 20 years, of artists both from Texas and from outside of Texas. When I first started, I was doing some outside of Texas because I had a much bigger budget, and then the budget began to shrink and all that with the crash, and then came back. But because I had a decent budget to work with, I was able to bring artists to Dallas, African-American artists, or I should say African diaspora artists, because I was looking at more than just African-American artists, to expose. I was primarily interested in the Black community, seeing what a diverse group of people were making art under the banner of Black artists. Because African Americans also have a very limited view oftentimes of what it means to be an artist and what does that mean in terms of imagery. So I wanted to be able to show them the wide range of conversations that African American artists were having. This particular artist is a Houston artist, Robert Hodge, and I curated a show that he wanted to do around the idea of the past informing the present. And this show, Living in the Past is My Future, is the show we put together. These are just two examples of the pieces that were in the show. I should say that the gallery in the Cultural Center, because I was there long enough to influence the creation of the gallery when we did the expansion, I was able to get a really good functioning gallery together, because before, when I first went there in '97, it was just like 4 corner walls with a bunch of pillars, which I wasn't sure what that was supposed to be other than to discourage art. But I was able to really design a gallery that was fully functional, beautiful, and so I was able to put together really substantial shows as a result of that. See what I mean? It's like it conspires against me. Yeah. Going way back, before I actually took over the center, I was an adjunct curator for the African American Museum in Dallas. And I curated a show in 1995 that actually, at Dallas Morning News, said was the best show of 1995 in Dallas. I'll just take that there. It was a clay show. And it was 4 artists working in clay that I was particularly interested in. The show was entitled Contained, Uncontained, because I was looking at the way in which some artists were still sort of keeping themselves tied to the vessel, and other artists were simply using the medium to say other things. And the 4 artists involved were James Watkins, who's from Lubbock, was for many years on the faculty of Texas Tech. Martha Jackson Jarvis, who is an old friend from Philly, who now lives in Maryland, who does actually many different types of things. This is an example of one of her installations, clay pieces, but what I showed in the show, she had done this very large table with these collard greens that were made out of clay that were cascading off the table. Her conversation around the way in which food is critical in the Black experience, but more importantly, the way the collard green was a substantive food element that kept us alive, basically. And then Magdalene Odundo, who at that time was living in London, was originally from Nigeria, and Sid Carpenter, who's actually a friend from childhood almost, in Philadelphia. She's about to retire as the primary clay professor at Swarthmore. And so all of these artists had work that was very different than what most people would have been thinking about when they think clay. And for me, the idea that Sid was having a narrative conversation, because she did a lot of pieces at that time, that were around the idea of how Black families interact. And even though they were abstracted forms, they were all about that kind of a conversation. Magdalene Odundo did these amazing pieces. Those pieces that she did were hand done. No wheel was involved. It was all hand-built work, which I was like blown away by, because I was for that long a ceramics major when I first went to college, because RISD had such a bad sculpture department at the time. I was just blown away, because I could never throw anything on the wheel, much less build something that would look like that. And then, of course, Martha was doing these installations, very large-scale installations with clay. And then James had really sort of pioneered this way of making vessels that were huge vessels, very large. He called them double-walled vessels that were cauldrons, essentially. They were the size of cauldrons. These are examples of the way in which I have approached doing curation. You know, sometimes it's a theme that I want to look at. Other times it's a material that I'd like to explore and see how artists are working with that material. And sometimes it's a topic, not necessarily a theme, but a topic that I think needs to be explored. But every time that I do that, I'm always looking to see who are those artists that are really sort of pushing the envelope, so to speak, in those areas, so that I'm trying to show my community someone they might not have seen otherwise. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the, not my practice per se, but something that Benito brought up regarding the way in which the power structure in the art world works. Because, like you said, you know, if you're not represented by a gallery, and it's not just any gallery, you have to be represented by a powerful gallery, a gallery that actually has real relationships with museums, then there's very little chance, and this is for any artist, white, black, brown, whatever, you know, if you're not associated with a powerful gallery, the chances of you getting into a museum collection are very slim. I was fortunate because I was in an exhibition that was sponsored by the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and because the curator, the contemporary art curator in that museum saw the work in this show and decided to collect it, that sort of got me, and this is what I found out, is once you're in the pipeline, you're in the pipeline. Because from that collection, her collecting that piece for the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, I was then contacted out of the blue by the Phoenix Art Museum to be a part of their biennial, or triennial rather. And it went on from there, and I realized I was in, you know, it's like I had been dubbed okay, and from there I could get contacts from other museums that I did not even know were interested. That doesn't happen often, and I recognize that. And Allison and I have, you know, consequently we've become very good friends. And she's the one that told me, because I was doing installation, you know, which I didn't even think about getting collected, because you do an installation, it's there and it's gone, you know. She's the one that informed me that I needed to value my installations in the same way that anybody else would value a painting or whatever. That it could be sold, and that it needed to be, you know, priced in such a way that it was fair, that I was getting what it was worth. I mean, she really talked me through how do you, as an installation artist, have your work collected. Now, I will say that was both a bittersweet kind of a thing to happen to me, because as you could see from my video about my work, I want my work to be engaged with the audience. It's about engagement. There's always this sound element. You heard that audio, but that's part of the installation. That's an important part of the installation. Once a museum collects my work, chances of it being put out all the time are very slim. I think it's been out 3 times at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston since it was collected in 1993 or 94. And that doesn't make me all that happy, because I really do want people to interact with it. So there's always this, what is the way to best collect an artist? And when it comes to artists of color and the ways in which they've been collected, now we're in this big, you know, big response to the George Floyd murder and all of that, where a lot of museums now are rushing out to find black artists that they could put in their collection. Well, that's great. But if it's not sustained, if the idea is not to be having the same kind of attention paid to collecting artists of color that is paid to every other you know, white artist that gets collected, then that's not a sustainable model for building an inclusive collection. And I feel that part of that comes from the fact that you have very few curators that are of color in major museums, and even in smaller museums, very few. And if they're not the senior curator, that's the other thing. There is this whole tier of curation that you have to understand. Someone who's like an assistant curator doesn't have the power to decide that this is what will get shown. So you have to make sure that there's a across-the-board understanding that there's a commitment by the institution to broaden what they're collecting. And then there's, like the DMA, God bless them. It's my city's museum, but I am by no means, confused about why we have happening what we have happening there. Because as Benito said, the collectors and the board is not supposed to be involved in the curatorial process, but we all know that's not true. That's not how it happens. There are two families who are collectors who have made commitments to donate their collections to the museum at some point when they expand. So now the big conversation is around the expansion of that museum and what should be done. I publicly made a statement that I thought that it would be great if they're going to expand and get more room, that they expand their collection of artists of color. And I understand that didn't go over too well, because it's clear that this expansion was supposed to be in relationship to these two family collections that they're waiting to get. But I figured, nobody's employing me. I say what I want, and that's what I felt, because after seeing what the Museum of Fine Arts Houston did with the Kinder, when they opened that new wing and there were several floors of artists of color, that could be a way to even the playing field a bit. But we'll see what happens. Then I think the other thing that I wanted to just touch on before we get into our conversation as curators is there is a question, and we can't bypass it, there is a question of money. Because resources are critical when it comes to collecting. These things don't get collected by osmosis. They have to be paid for. And many times the reason why we end up with the heavy preponderance of white male artists, because it's not even female artists, is that that's who these collectors are collecting. And if they want to have their collections increase in value, they have to be in museums as well. So when you see these sort of private, now this is a new thing, the private museums that are being created, like the Rubel collection and these other collectors who are creating their own museums, it's to increase the value of their collections. And those are the things that make it possible or impossible for the expansion and the inclusion of artists who have not previously been there. So if these artists are not being collected by major collectors and then put in these museums, once again, it's about resources, whether or not there can be any movement in that area. And I wanted to say this, you need to understand this as a reality in America as well. When we talk about the gallery system, understand that the majority of galleries are run by women, which I always found very interesting, that they're run by women, but they don't necessarily show women. And so, we have that dynamic that we have to wrestle with. And of course, needless to say, there are very few galleries that are devoted specifically to African Americans and or Latinx people. So all of this is to say that it's a very complicated system. Curating for museums is very different than curating as an independent like I have been and like Leslie has been. We get invited to curate something for a museum, but we're not part of the structure that determines that this will be a part of this season and it will always be a part of the season. We're sort of the add-ons. So that system has to be examined on every level if we're expecting to really impact. Kate, you asked the question, how do you change these things? Well, you're not going to change it by not having anybody on staff in the curatorial room who is of color. And like they say in the Black community, in all skin ain't kin. So it's gotta be somebody who actually has the knowledge about that particular group, if that's what you're trying to expand on. You also have to have people at the top levels who are willing to allow those curators the freedom to put together the kinds of shows, like Leslie was talking about, the board being very nervous. You can't have that kind of an attitude bringing in a curator. You can't have them coming in already handicapped by your fear of what your community might say or do or whatever. There has to be that notion that we're fearless, we're going to make change, and change does not come without some consternation. That's just the way revolution happens. Somebody's got to fall. And we can't be afraid of that. So I think that, when we're thinking about change, inclusion, equity, all of those things related to bringing new people on and into the fold, we have to understand that someone is going to feel like they're getting trampled on, that their rights are being evaded. Someone's going to feel that. But that's just sort of what has to happen, because I'm looking for systemic changes. I'm not looking for simply, because I remember the 60s, I'm old enough that I remember the 60s, and we were all thinking the Black Power movement, we were all going to be up in this, now. That moment came, that moment went, and we went right back to business as usual. So we need to recognize that if we're not going to go back to business as usual, we have to be looking at the systemic changes that need to take place in the art world in order for us to be able to even broach real conversations on equity, inclusion, and diversity.
Vicki, if it's okay, can we have questions during our discussion? No, we can have questions during the discussion for time, if that's okay with you.
Oh, yeah.
That's okay. I would be a bit remiss to mention to you all, if you're not aware, that there's a wonderful exhibit in San Antonio at the Centro de Artes, and that applause is relative to this wonderful exhibit, the New York Foundation for the Arts Immigrant Artist Program, Around 2, and two of our curators for that exhibit, Kim Bishop and Luis Valderas, are here with us today. Please go see the show. It features the work of immigrant and first-generation artists in our region, in conversation and with support from more established artists in San Antonio. So it's a wonderful sense about community is growing and developing and opportunities for change. So please go take a look at that show. And at El Centro de Artes. And I'm not sure the web address, but you all can find that easy in the city of San Antonio. I'm not shutting it. Thank you. So we have very energetic speakers, so thank you all for speaking today. We'll have other folks come up here for a conversation. I love the opportunity of talking about art, and I will say that I am not exactly embarrassed that our time is, moving towards the established time, but I'm very excited because I think we've had some wonderful talks. And I have the great pleasure to introduce the moderator for our conversation, Aïssatou Sidimé-Blanton. I will admit before a little bit of her biography that she has changed my life in many ways, personally and professionally, so thank you, Aïssatou. But beyond that, Aïssatou is a collector, a curator, a writer, and she's a patron of the arts. She is the vice president and a former curator of the San Antonio Ethnic Art Society, which is a 35-year-old organization. The 30th anniversary of that group sees us here in the gallery upstairs, and I had the great opportunity myself of curating that show. Aïssatou is a member of the San Antonio Area Foundation's Community Advisory Council. She has written for the International Review of African American Art, the San Antonio Express News, Black Focus Magazine, the Tampa Tribune, and blackbook.com. She's also worked a lot with Stone Metal Press and Gemini Inc. in San Antonio, as well as the Harbor Community Cultural Center, curating shows and various programs in the city. With her husband, Stuart Blanton, she has underwritten a grant, a $3,000 grant, through the San Antonio Ethnic Art Society, which is a biennial grant to support visual arts research, and curatorial projects by African American women. Thank you, Aïssatou, for coming here today.
Thank you, Scott.
I'm going to do the computer part, Scott. Quick tech shift.
Have actual, we're going to look at some guys who show that they curate, is that correct? Benito and both of these are Benito. And then I have brought in a couple of, actually I think 6 or 7 different publications that are three of you all come to the desk and say they have, it's called Black Art in America. It's one of places to go and learn about contemporary African artists now. Today, it started as an online site that was available for artists to show work and for curators or art historians, writers to actually publish works. It began actually printed last year. So they print 6 times a year. You all come get copies. Actually, it's a nonprofit. It's designed to be paid for shipping for 1 copy. You get 10 back. So I wanted copies and I have plenty of extra, so please come up. I don't want to take this back home with me. Some of you may recognize this particular issue because it is one of our Austin artists, Deborah Roberts, who is a very popular contemporary artist today, whom I've known, and Vicki knows, and several other folks know, but then there are other artists that are here. So please do help yourself. If you need to move the mic, or we're thinking the mic will be fine. So I know our time is short. I want to focus the conversation on equity, similar to the conversation Benito had started, because most of us know about diversity, the idea of bringing in different voices. We have a good sense of what inclusion is, that is making people feel like they're respected, they're a part of what's happening in a space. But how many of us really know what equity is? Show of hands for our audience. Do you feel like you know what equity is? I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So probably about a quarter of the room here. I don't know if the audience is out in virtual world. It's probably very similar. It's one of those concepts that I think every of us is clear about. But when we talk about justice and fairness, it's at the core of that concept. And so what I want to talk about is how does that apply to the curator? How do you think about your shows being just and fair to the artists and to the communities that you're working with? How we're trying to reflect. And then we'll go into looking at some actual examples of if people are doing it well. I have some ideas on what you all have. I'm going to try to watch the time, but probably give us at least 30 minutes. I'll come out with questions. So why don't we start? And you don't have to feel compelled to answer all of the questions. So for you all, we would like to talk about what equity means for you in your work, in your career.
I guess in my case, because I have always, well, for most of my career, I have been associated with a particular type of institution. Equity for me was more around the idea of not being stuck in just one type of African diaspora work. Because I was not, I mean, unless I'm invited like Women in Their Work or a place like that to do a show, I was doing most of my curating at the South Dallas Focus Center, which has a very specific mission. So if you want to talk about what I think equity should be for other institutions that are not ethnic specific. You know, I think that it's really about understanding access. That so much of what has caused the inequities is lack of access by way of gatekeepers. So, you know, you have Black, brown, Asian, indigenous artists who never even get past the door because the gatekeeper is not even aware that they exist. And rather than acknowledge that they don't know where they are, they just say they don't exist. And so I think that's part of the problem with equity is that equity has been curtailed by lack of knowledge and lack of willingness to learn and to admit that you don't know.
Yeah, I think I would agree on that too. I think a lot of my work, since I've been invited to different institutions, there's never one particular vision or vision I come up with. And so the definition of equity always changes. It's like, well, what is the way that I can kind of nudge this organization or institution into thinking equity? What does it mean to pay artists for their work, for example? And a lot of times it's really kind of about sort of dismantling the idea of what the white is, what the standards are. These standards exist because people say they exist, so they can also be broken down because we can't. And so really like revealing that to like boards or institutions is really important as well.
What's one way that you have had success working? Can you give us an example? Because I think it can be hard to figure out how to change the system in order to make it work.
I just wanted, before we move on from that, I posed the question when Leslie was at the podium, how do we initiate change? We all can envision what the solution is, which is having more voices at the table, more different kind of voices at the table. But how do we instigate that change? And my answer to that, after having thought about it, is I really think it's in education. And starting very early on in, nursery school. And that then gets into politics, right? Like who are our politicians and what kind of support is public education earning and what are we teaching those young children? And if we can shift that, then by the time those children grow up and are adults of the age that they could enter the boardroom, then they're ready. Then they're prepared to participate in a substantive way. So I think that, and so I will say that the way my actions as a curator are really intertwined with my work as a teacher. And I live it every day. And though I'm in higher ed, so the students I teach are much older than the ones I was there. It's almost like, it's never too late, I don't think. But the demographic I'm presented with is not as diverse as it should be, quite honestly. But if we keep at it year upon year, that will change too. But I would say that's how I try to live, to walk my talk, is what I teach in the classroom, what scholars, what artists, what practices I share with my students.
One of the things that when I came to UTA, I've been already curating, and as I mentioned, some of the shows that I've curated were Hispanic shows, Latino shows, that kind of thing, and other shows. But when I came to UTA, one of the things I wanted not to do is to label artists. I didn't want to do a Hispanic show, I didn't want to do an Asian show, I didn't want to do an African American show. I just wanted to show artists and their work. So one of the interesting things within the year after I started there, one of the shows I curated was a show of Fort Worth artists, Susan Harrington and Cesar Martinez, who's from here. And one of the comments that was made, not to me directly, but again, I did these things indirectly, was, why are you showing this Latino artist with Susan Harrington? And I thought, if you actually look at the work, there's a lot of similarities. The work is different as far as the way the visuals are. There's a lot of similarities in their thinking about how they make their work. And I think this is one of the things that I wanted to is get rid of the labels and let's look at their work. Because I think that we've gotten into the situation where putting these categories and labels in. I remember when the Blanton decided that they were not going to have, that the Latin American collection was going to mix in with the rest of the collection. And I thought that was a big step, because it's all of a sudden, it's not about, where they come from, but it's about their ideas. And that's, artists work with ideas. Now the ideas can be all kinds of ideas. But it's like, when you start putting categories, you're saying like, well, because he's Hispanic, then he's dealing with Hispanic issues. And, that's not true. I mean, these categories can work against one as well. So I just wanted to illuminate those kind of categories. Let's look at the artists and let's look at their work. For me, at some point, the artists of color, what I think is to rise above, get to the point where you're doing a one-person exhibition of their work, so you're actually looking at the work and at the artist and not looking at their, like, who they are as far as being Latino or Black or whatever. But yes, who they are is going to be reflected in the work, and I think that's always going to be a given. But it's like, again, I'd like to see barriers be broken down, not kept intact.
We have a situation where we've been talking about how do we get more work from people with different perspectives into museums, into collections. When there was no focus on ethnic background and racial representations, since there has been a focus, there are varying views on whether things have shifted. Most of us have heard about looking at women in the arts and the number of, or lack thereof, of women in museums and in collections. A lot of the way DEI is being looked at today is, yes, we do count. It's counting is still important. You're not quantifying something. It's sort of when you are trying to encourage people in a general workplace. If you don't make it a priority and you look at whether people are addressing a priority, you don't know if those people can usually don't make it a priority. But is that all that you have? And the reason I'm bringing it up is because City of Houston really recently did a study to have a complete survey of the 677 artworks in its collection. This is from a report from 2020. 390 different artists. And not just who was in the collection by gender and by ethnicity, but also looking at whether it changed based on the different administrations that were in power in the city. And the interesting thing is that it did not. Even after there was a focus on having a specific initiative and program, you had something like 20% total, it's quite 20%, about 17, 18% Hispanic, Asian, and African American all total in their collection previously and today, or at the point of this, it was versus 75% that were annual white people. Same thing for the gender makeup. You have 60% of pieces and 60% of the budget was spent on work for men in 2000 versus in 2019 when we conducted the study. And similar, 75% of the budget. And then when you get people of color, female people of color, it's like 2.5%, 17 pieces out of $677. But the goals, the results were, yes, it doesn't, as you point out, it doesn't, it's insufficient to just have people counting or have people in the room. You still have to have some concrete target in order to bring them. And so the other thing I was looking at, just looking around what we're doing around the country, is in Rhode Island, looking at what some of the state administrators are doing in the arts. They said, basically, their state arts commission, 3 of every 5 folks who are on their arts commission panel making decisions in terms of what shows will get dollars, in terms of those positions, decision makers have to be color. They've made a commitment based on what's happening in the community. It looks like there's some conflict maybe on whether we need to count or what we should be counting. And once we determine again what the discrepancies are, how do we move forward? My thought is, if 10 galleries control the museums, or the donors and the board controls the museums, how can we get someone around us, whatever, can we create alternate pipelines to show work, to encourage collection of that work, or to encourage a sense of value in the work that's not shown. Like those galleries, that help.
It's like the whole system is so wonky. Seriously, when you think about the fact that in America, because the arts are not primarily funded by the government, where in many countries that is the main support for culture, is government, that it become, and it's always set up this way, it's become the purview of the wealthy. That's what the arts have been in this country, because it was a way of sort of the New World reach, coming from the real reach from Europe, but was to imitate what they saw in Europe. And that's what set us up from the very beginning when we started having it. Remember, the arts in America is a very new concept when you think about it. I mean, because the Puritans weren't into art. They weren't about art at all. They were about refreshing.
Curating is
Exactly. So because it was all about the wealthy giving over, the largesse was coming from them, and it was their vision. And it's not much different now. So you really are talking about a total disruption of a system that was set in place to preserve the collections of the wealthy, and to have that vision be the one that these institutions that they created, because let's face it, very few public art museums existed until relatively recently. So, how do you disrupt that money flow?
And I think the alternate pipelines are there. There's a Mexicarte Museum, there's an African American Museum at the Smithsonian, but they're not as empowered as the more established ones. So I think the question is how to empower the alternative pipeline, and probably through resources, probably through economic resources.
Because I sit on the Arts Commission in Dallas, and one of the things that I've said, it ain't popular, but I've said it, is that if we don't have the money in the community that is able to guide and give and all of that, at the very least, public dollars, which everybody pays taxes and everybody, contributes to, the public dollars ought to be more directed towards the under-resourced organizations of color than the major institutions, which make up the majority of where that money goes.
I think it's dollars and mentorship as well, because a lot of times these institutions are not set up to handle kind of income either, to receive these big donations. It's like, where does it
Except
go?
most of the time they are. I'm sorry. Those directors have the same knowledge. They may not have all the staff, but they know. You give me $1 million, that's your money. I'm gonna spend that money wisely.
And I don't think every small nonprofit has that.
I don't think they don't need to. I think, like you said, we have African American museums in most cities. We don't necessarily have Latinx museums in most cities, but we have some major, institutions. We have some indigenous ones. We have them. If we wanted to redirect those public dollars to those institutions.
And that could be a way to start to make the pipeline not an alternate one, but the pipeline. And then we get to the point that Benito's talking about where those barriers are erased. And we don't talk about an origin of the artist or ethnicity, but rather we talk about art as art, right?
That's very
But until we get to the point where there's a dominant pipeline and an alternative one, the conversation will probably end up, where it is. And I think that's why the educational bit is so important. Like from the point of a child's birth, we try to eradicate this systemic racism that our country was built upon.
But I think
That's
also
the hard
the educational model, for me, I always think that a proponent of that art should be taught from 1st through 12th. Not simply because I want more artists, I don't need more competition. But because it's a way for people to be creative and to be also problem solvers, because artists are great problem solvers. And it's like whatever field they go into, it's going to be beneficial to them. And I think that instead of STEM, it should be STEAM. And I think we want, if we're going to keep going, we need to incorporate the arts not just as a place where we enjoy work, but it's also a place that challenges our work, but also a way to, how do we think about how we think, period.
Yeah, I mean, valuing it at a very young age.
So, exactly.
But understand that was very systematically taken out of. I mean, there are two things that were taken out of the curriculum, the standard public school curriculum at the end of the Vietnam War, and that is arts and civics. They didn't want people to know how this country worked, and they didn't want anybody to put it together. So take those things out of the education, and you have some dumb people. And that's what we have today. Uninformed people who don't even know basics about how America works. You know. So that was systematic though, because when I was doing, back in the 70s, when I was a part of the NEA study on education and arts education, we had all the data that shows what the arts do for poor children. We know what that does. On out of the curriculum of public education. And public education is primarily poor, brown, and black children at this point in America. That's who's mostly getting educated in the public system. So I agree with you, Kate, that education at the very earliest moment is when it should start. Because, I grew up in Philadelphia, so I was lucky there was a lot of arts. Everything was free at that time. 1950s, back to the dark ages. That's when you could go into public school, and if you wanted to play an instrument, they should give it to you. If you wanted to do art, the Philadelphia Museum had a school that I went to, Fleischer Memorial Art School. I mean, that kind of thinking existed back then. But then they got to the fact you can't have anything. And it was, now that's not there anymore. So
I agree that that education is important. That is a 15, 20-year process, if you will. I feel like there are things we can do today to bring more voices in and to bring them in more fairly. And so I want to talk about some of the things that some of the states are looking at. I also want you guys to think about what institutions you know are doing a good job. And I'm going to talk about the Arlington Museum and what it's done, its commitment to purchases, as well as some of the actual that can show us up there. Related to the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, doing this study, DEI and State Arts put out this report in May of last year, where they found half of the country's state arts agencies all have that 1% requirement. Any capital project has to be used for arts programs. So most states are doing this to some degree. Typical obstacles we talked a bit about what their recommendation of the work to help move people down, de-emphasizing the applicants for those public art projects, their history, their past performance, their past projects. Not tying dollars to a particular space, a particular park, or a particular building, convention center, what have you, but saying we have a budget of dollars that are available for temporary projects, or in some cases, as you said, mentorship. So you take someone who may not have as much experience building this huge sculpture, but you'll teach them what they need, their funds of that 1% that go there. The idea of actually getting rid of some of the costs for applying some of the technological hurdles in some cases for rural communities, and where they may not be able to even apply online for a lot of these grants and mass packaging have to be submitted that way. And then also looking at things like installers, fabricators, those folks who help with these projects. I just want to know, are any of those resonating for whatever you add that states can basically decide, or local governments can decide this is going to be part of how our process can be changed?
Well, I also sit on the public art program in Dallas, so I can tell you that in the state of Texas, that's a challenge because the state actually has put the restrictions on how public money can be utilized, and that is one of the reasons. I worked for the Connecticut Commission on the Arts before I moved to Texas, and we had a robust program of arts grants for artists, not tied to any bogus project, but just money to do the work. When I moved to Texas, I was amazed that there was no way an individual artist could get public dollars just to do their work. We just, in the last few years in Dallas, instituted a program where artists can apply for an Arts Activate grant, but it has to be tied to a service to the community. You can't just do this to do your work. So if your state is restricting that, the cities are not going to buy that because they don't want to lose any of the state support that they get. And therefore, it makes it hard to have what you're talking about happen, because our public art program has to be tied to the money. First of all, it's not in our general fund. It comes through the departments that have public works. So like, for instance, the Park and Recreation Department is always doing something so that the percentage of their money go towards public art. Water Department, same thing. It's not coming through the general fund where we could say, just what you're talking about, it's not tied to a particular building, it's just, there's a pot of money for public art. All of our public art money is tied to specific city departments. So unless you can change all of that system to be something different, many of the cities in Texas don't have the ability to say, yes, we're just going to do this way.
Are there concepts that maybe in the private institutions students pick up?
Louder, please.
We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I said, are there pieces of these ideas that maybe the private institutions can or could pick up? The thing of funding more of the fees, funding the greater mentorship opportunities. I know some of the African American institutions like the Harvard Museum in Austin now has its own actual fellowship program that it didn't for years. It's part of small institutional fellowship community that's trying to do that, to try to
Well, I think there are institutions, I mean, in Nashville, for instance, that you brought up. I mean, I think that there are institutions that are doing that. Now, you know, it's not going to be massive numbers of artists that are benefits, maybe a couple of artists per year. But I mean, like, for instance, my relationship with the Nashville is about to change. I've done 2 major installations for them. And now we're in conversation about me being their first fellow, which is going to be a massive amount of money that they have to raise in order for that to happen. Because I've proposed a 3-year project that involves not just me as an artist, but I have applied for the artists, you know. So there are institutions that are thinking that way. But you are talking about, bottom line, it's going to be money. Yeah. You know, they have to have the money. And a lot of people don't realize this, but a whole bunch of museums are operating in the red. They don't talk about it, but they're operating in the red. So the idea of just having the money to do these kinds of things is just totally shift the conversation. It's a big idea. Somebody has to fight for it.
One of the interesting things was, back in the 80s, when Reagan was president, one of the things was he wanted to shift funding for the arts from government to the private sector. So because it's like I said, you know, basically we should be funding the arts. But it didn't, I mean, the NEA was still survived all that, but it's just all of a sudden, it's like, you need to have individuals, foundations fund the arts, but you can't do it all. And, you know, I think that there are a lot more foundations now that do those things are popping up because there are a lot of people who made a lot of money the last few years. And it's not us. So, but they wanted to spend the money, and some of them have like, okay, let's fund some of the visual arts, or the humanities, or both, or the sciences. They all have their kind of favorite area, arena that they want to fund, which is great, but I think it goes still, you know, the NEA and NEH have been attacked by Congress, which is one of the things that they've done in both sides over the years. It goes back to, I think, the late 80s.
Culture wars.
Yeah, culture wars, and Maple Thorpe, and Serrano, and all that. And it just started then, and it's like, at that time, they used to fund visual artists. And they used to give grants to visual artists. And really, yeah, it's good grants, and then it's like, less than 1% were controversial. And yet, because of a few, and people like Maple Thorpe didn't even apply for a grant. Was it Cincinnati that did Maple Thorpe? They applied for a grant from the AA for the show, the gala, and all that. Maple Thorpe didn't see any money from that. It was just Huerta that got focused. And yet, they would, when the budget for the NEA got cut, the first thing to go was funding for artists, you know, and that's the way it is. And then after that, it just got,
Now it goes
you
to
know, it got
institutions, institutional support rather than individual artist support.
And for projects in particular.
Right, yeah, that's right.
It's a mess.
Well, it is, I mean, it's a systemic, I mean, Vicki's right, it's a systemic problem, and to solve it is a really big, and like, you know, you just come up with one idea, and then there's all these other reasons why that idea can't not manifest. So I think it's
overwhelming.
Well, and I think that's why the thing is, we would like to train a new generation, right? We need to train a new generation to think differently, and then another person will be in the seat of the Senate. Will be 50 new, 100 new senators that have been trained differently, and then they'll think differently, and then maybe our government will fund individual artists again. I think that's, because if we just do it a little bit at a time, I don't want to be a pessimist, because I'm not. I'm actually trying to err on the side of optimism. We can continue to chip away a little at a time. But I think that these hierarchies are very difficult to dismantle. And I think they're global. I don't think it's just the US. I mean, we are probably the guiltiest, but I don't think it's just us. I do
think that there was not too long ago, like I say not too long ago, maybe like 20 years, there was the idea that the NEA could be totally dissolved. And I actually wonder if that actually is not a bad idea. And you hear me out, and start over, because basically what would happen is that there would be a huge backlash, because a lot of the people in office don't realize that NEA money goes down to not only the big cities, it goes into small towns. I remember hearing about, I don't know if it was in Montana or somewhere, where they were saying, the NEA gets, that's our funding, we won't have, this little orchestra that we have. I mean, it's like, it's really deeply rooted.
But then there's that whole thing, like rural, urban too. We haven't even talked about that, and that's the whole different.
Part of the problem, Benito, was, and I actually said something to my friends that work at the NEA about this. When they did the campaign with the last beginning of the new cultural war, I said, you know what? You are focusing on the wrong audience. You having Robert Redford and all these famous people talking about the arts. You need to be having these rural communities whose only money is coming from the NEA. You need to have their faces up there in Alaska and all. They're the ones who need to be saying, hey, we need this money. But they made it a celebrity thing. And once again, the budget maybe it didn't get cut totally, but it was cut. And it's not even back to where it was before the first cultural war.
And they don't have any other funding.
Nope.
And that's it.
And it's always a target. I mean, I don't care what's going on. It's always, they're going to always circle back to the NEH and the NEA as being the buildings.
And their budgets are so small anyway, relative to the rest of it.
It's a drop in the bucket. It's a drop in the bucket.
There are institutions that are making progress.
There, I mean, absolutely. And
I want to highlight the Baltimore Museum. They made a commitment. They took all of those duplicate pieces by the white male artists in their collection. They started selling them off and committed in 2019 to buying all the works by people. Last year, they decided that in addition to thinking of it's not just about gender or about race or ethnicity, who are the voices that we're showing from our communities, actually created a situation where they brought in their curator, Aïssatou, said, I am going to work with the people who know our space and who are here, and who people probably ignore all the time. The 17 security guards were always there monitoring, protecting the art, and help them curate a show. Their show just opened, guarding the art, but she spent a whole year working with those artists and looking at what was important, what were they interested in their communities, and then helping them look at the art that the museum had of their something like 95,000 pieces or something, some huge number, to choose pieces for that show. And so you have, I was looking at, there's a vet, which chose pieces that were of interest to him. There was someone who was studying to be a music major and a singer who chose works of art that spoke to him that were about music and about song. And then there were other folks who had other perspectives, but all of that was based on this community. And it's got great reviews since its opening. The change in the counts in their collection is happening because they have committed to take these duplicates or these white bills and use those dollars to buy something. So it can be done.
It can, you're right.
Bit by bit.
A little bit, yeah.
To
I mean, I'm not saying we should stop working. That's not what I mean at all. I'm just saying it is a, it's a big, but, you know, I wanted to give one other example, because I did read your email about what institutions do you think are exemplary, and I had to think really hard about it, to be honest. But I will use a local example again from where I'm currently residing, which is Cincinnati. And what the Cincinnati Art Museum did in 2020 was they said, okay, curators, staff curators, you need to step aside. We're going to reserve this gallery for a community-driven curatorial project. And they invited all guest curators, community members of color to decide what would go with that gallery. And they did it. I think it made the curators really uncomfortable, quite honestly, because they had spent a lot of time training to be the curators they were, and what they saw in the gallery is very different from what they would have put in there. But I think that was the whole reason why the institution actually committed to doing that, was to say, hey, these voices need to be heard too. So that was, I thought, a good example of a sort of stalwart institution that's been there for over 100 years, that has very high standards, opening up.
I wonder what the traffic has been.
Well, you know, the exhibit's no longer there, but it was up for 3 months, and I think it was very popular. And again, got a lot of press. It was really good for the museum as well as the artists that were exhibiting there, and a lot of people went. And it was during COVID as well, so people weren't going out as much, but they did to that show.
I'm going to ask if anyone else has other examples of those that are doing well, and then looking at our time, I'm thinking about, so right now we have folks in the room who are mentoring, who are professors and educators in museum studies and curating. They're helping to shape the minds of the folks who are going to be in the room making the choices in the future. What would you all say to them in terms of what they can do to get those curators thinking more broadly about what is good art, excellent art, whatever term you want to use, how to show pieces with other pieces, how to find new artists, you know, how just to go look, or even for those of us who curated on one, what would you recommend? So first, who else can give us an example of someone or some entity or institution I think is doing a good job? Or at least has made a commitment in writing, that has put some money behind the ideas, and are trying to do something.
I think the University Museum in Mexico City, Black, has made a year-long commitment to focus only on women in their exhibitions. While it seems like it's not a very big step, that's a huge step. And while it might be a small commitment, it's a big one. So that's one that was a massive shift for the institution, both the university and the museum. It's a good one.
It's a good one. I hear that.
Well, I've always been impressed with NFH. I mean, it's a big museum, and they have lots of curators, but Allison has been I've seen very few curators like her who go out into the community to see what's happening, and who has collected the local artists that are not in the basement in the vault, but on the walls in that museum.
And when you say go out into the community, what are you talking about?
Well, for instance, when I was in the first cohort of row houses, you know, she was out looking at the work. I mean, she didn't have to come to the show that was curated by the Glassell. I mean, she didn't have to. But she makes sure that she goes and sees the exhibits at the Verse Works, at Lawndale. She goes out and sees what's being shown. And that's the only way, to me, that you can expand your understanding of what's happening in your local community. You can't do it by just hearing something. You have to see the work.
I think that one of the things, I lived in Houston for a number of years, and I think Houston has a great art scene. I mean, I still feel partial to it, but part of it was that in Houston, we're talking about humidity. Yes, and it's like I said, it's like the great equalizer in Houston. But you know, it's like when there's a party, even at an artist place or a collector's place, everybody goes.
Yeah.
Everybody's invited. It's like the collector, the reviewers, the critics, the curators, the artists. They're all there. They're all intermixed. I don't see that in a lot of other cities, and other than a lot of other cities. And
that's why I built my art life. And when I moved to Texas, I built my art life in Houston, not in Dallas. Because Dallas was so segregated at the time. It's still pretty segregated, you know? I didn't understand those separations being so severe. And then I came to Houston because Michelle Barnes was the first person to show me in 1988, and I was like, why would you show me? You know, nobody knows me there. And she's like, man. And I came down here, and it's like the place was packed. I didn't know any of those people. I knew that there was something different happening in Houston, and it's my whole life has been in Houston. Until now, I mean, you know, this is my first, like, I'm with Tally Gun Gallery now, but that's 30 some odd years later, you know, I'm doing work in Dallas.
But I also think, and maybe it's in Houston, but I think it's also in Texas. I think that one of the things I still like in this area, and it used to be even more so, I guess, early on, because, you know, you didn't have a lot of institutions really paying much attention or, you know, showering you with money. So there was this kind of like this wildcatter attitude. Like, you get an idea, let's do it. You know, what do you got to lose? You got nothing to lose. And I remember I sat on a couple of NEA panels, and the second one was in 92, 93. And my peers from around the country were on these panels, usually about 20 people or so. And they had the largest amount of applications from visual arts organizations in Texas applying. And people were saying, well, what's going on in Texas? Because none of them been to Texas, I guess. And none of them knew. They thought Texas was still producing Western art. And it does, it did, it still does. But, you know, we have a really vibrant art scene. And it's like, and I thought, when I came back, I was actually a co-curator with Chris Calvin from the Word, Marty Mayo, who was at the Laffer, I think, and Al Harris, who was the director of the gallery that I'm now, back then. And I remember talking, and I said, you know, I was thinking, what's really missing? And I said, and I finally realized it's like, we don't have an art publication. You know, New York, LA, they have art publications, and they usually center around those areas. So that's one of the reasons why in the end I helped co-found an art magazine called Artwise. Because it was like we needed a voice. And not only just a voice within Texas, but to get it outside of Texas. It lasted for 17 years. I was one of the directors and then co-director. And it was like, how do we get that information out there? Because I think that one of the things that wasn't happening is that there wasn't this kind of networking, not only of what's happening in art, but of information. So one of the things I actually prided ourselves in was that the ads that we had were from all around Texas. So you can open it up and you say, oh, there's a show at the Beeville Art Museum. I didn't know Beeville had an art museum. You know, and there's all these smaller museums in these smaller towns that they have museums. You know, I mean,
Does the last tire feel that?
Not really.
Oh, wait.
Not to me.
Yeah.
Not to me. I'm serious because it was the same problem when I joined the board of Artwise. I felt like Artwise, when I joined the board, needed to have more diversity in who they, because I knew in Dallas that those reviewers were not going anywhere near artists of color. I knew that. So I see the same kind of thing with glass tires, that there's still a dearth of coverage of arts, unless it's in an institution that they know about. You know, that there's no, and it's, you know, I know people are not getting paid a lot, you know, it's all about what they already have access to.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of the problem. Texas is so big, and there's so much going on, that it's hard to cover everything, especially if you're not paying, you know, a lot of money for people to do this work. Because let's face it, right? You know, you have to start that way.
Yeah, and Castro does pay. Castro does pay, and pays okay, which is good. And that is one of the initiatives that I'm working on with Brandon as guest editor, so getting into peripheral areas of the state. It's also really difficult
necessarily. Like, it requires more work. It requires working closer with the writer as well, which is very time consuming. I like to do that, so it's not a problem for me. And I just started, and so this is also one of my guest editorship of last year was only supposed to be until March, but I realized very early on that I couldn't get my feet under me with the work and then do the outreach and be done by March, and so we extended it until May for that reason. But yeah, it's a massive amount of work. It really is.
I will say there, I think technology is helping.
Yes. Yeah.
Because if you have a show, you can film your own show and talk and show the art, and you can submit your video online and you post it. And that, previously you had to wait for a writing company. So I think that, from my perspective as a collector or someone who just wants to see what's happening, I'm just going to put on a video.
Which I think has been really cool for Glassfire to do for the pandemic, those 5-minute tours, those videos. Like, there were so many during the pandemic. I was stuck in Mexico. I was like, oh, look at that, I can see this show, that I'm really interested in this artist. And they've continued that after the pandemic has done and stuff.
But it's always about who knows what. Because I'm thinking about Christopher Blake, who did the thing about the 101 Black artists, and then everybody's like, wait a minute. And I gave him a whole list of people, but he's, Chris said, I know what I know, and I'm glad I know this, because it's tells me a lot more.
And at the end of the day, I'm one person versus one person, right? So it's like, what is our reach, really? What can we do as individuals? Yeah.
I think that presents a problem too, though, is that I've found that in the curatorial world, is that every curator has their artist that they favor. That happens, it happens with me, I realize that. But I think the really good curators are ones who go out and keep on looking and seeing people who they're not familiar with. And those are the ones who are trying to expand their own reach, and I think it's real important. But it's a lot of work, and it takes effort. It takes effort on all levels to make change. And at an institutional level, it's so entangled. It's difficult.
We need to have more parties. Of the curators, the artists, the writers, the museum gallery directors. We need to be reaching out and just going places we don't feel comfortable. I think I see a couple of hands. Scott, can we take questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm going to express a dissenting opinion here on what you were talking about earlier, and that is...
Can you talk a little louder?
Can you hear me?
No.
I'm going to express a dissenting opinion from the earlier discussion about what may be the solution to the dilemmas that we have in keeping art alive and keeping diversity alive in the country. Art has always been funded by elites, whether it's the bourgeois or the popes or whoever's in political power, and have tried to dominate that. But in this country, our wealth, government wealth, is minuscule compared to private wealth. It is a huge, huge difference that we have to recognize. And I wonder how many of you feel that one of the reasons that we are having difficulties in getting art functioning the way it should, and where the art structure in this country should work, has to do with the fact that we haven't been very good about public relations, fundraising, educating docents, and initiatives like have been discussed earlier, in the way in which we should create our own power in this country, and the power that was referred to in discussions earlier here today. I'm not sure, given the nature of the politics in this country today, I want the government messing in art.
Well, I just look at it this way. We have in this country set our priorities. You say we're not wealthy as a government, we are. Look at how much money is spent on war. Look at how much money the military gets. We have prioritized how our wealth will be spent from the government standpoint, and it's not on culture or education for that matter. I look at Costa Rica, who dismantled their army, and all that money went into education. But we could set priorities that would allow culture to be at the center. But no, we have decided something different, and that is military might. So I would refute the idea that we are that more money is available in the private sector than the government sector. We just have different priorities about how that government money should be spent. And culture has never been at the center of it.
We have a question.
Yes.
Right here. Yes, ma'am.
So, we were talking about funding, and, it kind of takes me back to when there was a time when the government looked at, governmental institutions looked at the way that museums were organizing their shows, and that word multiculturalism was everywhere. So the exhibitions had to represent the community at large. So they would look at the community, they were looking at the programming, and that affected your funding. Now, what I see happening, because I help fundraise, is now you're looking at the composition of your board and your staff. Because what we're talking about is, what you were talking about is like, the board was nervous about this exhibition. Well, if you have diversity on your board and the board is actively being educated, then that's where change is, that's where power is. And we all need money. All of these, organizations and these institutions exist for the community and to build bridges. And those are the things that we need to look at, because it's all about power in the pie, So that's all I have to say. And I would like to ask a question about collectors, because my work gets into museums not because people come to me or galleries. I've never had representation. And I think when your work is experimental, it's not represented in galleries. So it's elsewhere. It's in alternative spaces. That's where the work gets shown. But there are people that believe in the work and they'll collect it, even if they can't show it in their home. Then my work gets into a museum, kind of, And so I think that the work that the Rebels have done, I've seen some amazing exhibitions, and there are other collectors in Texas and in California that look at work that is not being collected in museums, therefore they're collecting it. That's their legacy.
I would interject. We have a great example of that in San Antonio with Ruby City and Linda Pace and her legacy. She collected equally internationally as well as in San Antonio. To see that legacy sort of evolve into what it is presently has been pretty amazing.
Yes, and so I think that there is a place for that private collection, that private, looking at what has not been represented. I think Rudy Green does a great job.
Well, we need it all.
Yeah,
I think.
I think that it is. I would also mention Guillermo Nicolas and his funding for the arts here in San Antonio, contemporary art specifically. I mention that because I know that for Deborah Roberts, his decision to collect her work and start promoting her work on his social media to friends got attention of galleries, which got her into New York shows, which got her into Miami, which got her into Bellmeadow and her London reps, because he is a well-known and wealthy collector of contemporary art, and he was attracted to her work, right? So
it still goes back to that
network.
How
do you get into that network?
Did you find her via social media? How did you find her?
She had actually, it was from Scott's show that's curated. What is this, Scott? About 6 years ago now. Show at the Carver Cultural Center. One woman show for Deborah Roberts. And he went to that show, as I understand.
There's a question back here.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so I think you probably answered this just by not addressing it, but I kept wondering, is there something in the arts that's equivalent to Title IX, affirmative action, equal employment opportunity? It just feels like we're missing that link in this. Does that make sense? I don't know, maybe it's controversial to even ask that, but it feels like we keep talking about how we're trying to make diverse art, and no other institution ever did it unless they were forced in some way. And I feel like we're missing that. Do we not have anything in the arts? I'm new to learning about this, but do we not have anything like that?
HR administration.
HR.
The question is, do we have?
Well, there've been lots of movements.
that
There've been lots of
require
movements to push against the establishments, but that all of that is. Once again, I'd say the arts aren't important in this country.
Yeah.
And I say that's one of the reasons why they've been allowed to be languishing in this whole, morass of discrimination and everything, because no one cares enough to make them change the way they did law and education and medicine and all of those kinds of things. No one cares enough to do that. So it's within the artist communities that you have these uprisings, and the Guerrilla Girls came about because of the whole issue of women not being. But that's a very small microcosm of people to make something change that's as big as what we're talking about.
I do want to say that I think public art serves a purpose, because one of the things I do believe in public art is that it gets it out in the community. And there was an example of a Luis Jimenez sculpture called Vaquero, one of his well-known sculptures, was in Moody Park in Houston. And it's been politicized a couple of times in the 90s, and the person who was running for sheriff or something was talking about, it's situated in Moody Park, which is a Latino neighborhood, and it turns out that people were selling drugs at the park that the police was situated at. And instead of trying to deal with the drug culture there, they're blaming it on the sculpture. No, it's like everyone has a gun and the horse is barking, and it's a sculpture that's causing this problem, we need to get rid of it. And Luis, and this is the second time this happened, he came into town and there was a town hall meeting with and there's one kid, because I was there, he came up and said, I don't want you to take this away. I feel like this belongs to us, the community. And that's the power, I think, of art. I don't have to go to the museum, I don't have to go to the gallery, I can just come to the park. I don't want them to take it away. And I think that's what, is really good about public art. It takes it out of the white cube.
I will also say there's lots of wonderful programs, like Teen Arts Program, South School has, SAC, this Youth Arts Program, in the City of San Antonio, Art Cases Program. The universities, public institutions really work to train artists, to get the work out there. And there's one more comment here from Kim.
Well, I just feel like, so we have public art that is connected to bonds, right? Why isn't everything else in art connected to that same kind of bond? Like art as a whole needs to be seen as infrastructure. And that's how, I think that should be the push. And my second comment is, yes, art education, and that's why institutions like UTSA should be teaching art education, art pedagogy, as well as the artist, and as well as curating. I think there needs to be more art education departments so that educators are educated in art. So my two comments. Thank you.
More art history. More art history.
And more art history.
Thank you all. Thank you all. This has been a fantastic afternoon. Really. I'm inspired, actually. I've got some notes for myself in my own ideas and practice and for my teaching. Thank you all for coming in this afternoon. Thank you folks in the Zoom world.
Are we still on?
You,
is this thing on?
This is.
Like this. What's going on here?
Thank you all. You sound so good. Like it's amazing.
Thank you.